He had signed the order on a Tuesday. She had given birth on a Friday. Alone. In a room with fluorescent lights and a guard outside the door who was not allowed to hold her hand. Ren was 6 months old before Kale Morrow knew she existed. And by then, Lena was already 3 states away with a new name and the specific, hard-won knowledge of a woman who had learned what she was capable of surviving. The Tuesday in question had been the worst night of that year, which was saying something because the year had contained several strong competitors for that title. The Aldrin organization had hit a Morrow warehouse at 11:40 in the evening, a facility that was supposed to be secured, the location of which was not in any written document and was known only to the 7 people who needed to know it. 3 men were dead by midnight. Another 2 were in critical condition at a hospital that Kale's people had arrangements with. The loss in cargo was secondary. The loss in people was not something Kyle knew how to process in the way that people who had not built organizations from violence processed loss. He processed it the way he processed everything that threatened the thing he had built by finding the source and closing it. Silas Drent had found the source in 4 hours. That was the thing about Silas. He was the fastest mind in the room in any room Kyle had ever put him in. And for 11 years, Kale had used that speed the way a surgeon used a scalpel. Pointed and precise and completely trusted. Silas came to him at 3 in the morning with a folder. Inside the folder, a series of text messages between a number registered to a burner phone and a contact identified as an intermediary for Aldrin's logistics division. The messages detailed, over a period of 6 weeks, the location of the warehouse, the route schedules, the security rotation, the kind of information that only someone inside the innermost circle could have accessed. And on the final page of the folder, a financial record, a transfer, 4 days before the attack, from an account in the name of Elena Vasher Morrow, $16,000, to a shell company that Silas had traced, in his 4 hours, to the outer edge of Aldrin's financial network. Kale had looked at the name on the transfer for a long time. Silas had stood across the desk and said nothing, because Silas was smart enough to know that in this particular moment, nothing was the right thing to say. Kale had looked at the name, and he had thought about the 14 months the woman he had married 14 months ago. The woman he had let inside, a life he had spent 15 years building walls around. The woman who had looked at him across a dinner table 6 months into their marriage and said, in the specific, direct way she had, that she loved him in a way she hadn't expected to, and that it frightened her. He had looked at her then and thought, this is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. He had looked at the transfer record now and thought something different. Something that was not thought so much as the specific collapse of a structure that had been weight-bearing. He had picked up the pen. He had signed the order. He had not asked Silas whether he was certain. He had not called Lena. He had not done the thing that the part of him that was not consumed by the collapse of that weight-bearing structure would have done, which was to look at the woman he had married and ask her directly. He signed the order on a Tuesday at 3:47 in the morning, and he did not sleep after that, and he did not eat until the following evening, and he told himself that this was grief, and that grief was the appropriate response to betrayal, and he had been wrong about all of it. He would spend the next 8 months understanding exactly how wrong he had been. He would spend longer than that paying for it. Lena Vasher had been an accountant. Not for Kale's organization. She had known nothing about the organization when they met, which was one of the things about her that had caught his attention first. The way her eyes didn't do the calculation that everyone else's eyes did when they figured out who he was. She had been doing the books for a restaurant group in Chicago that had 1 legitimate location and 2 that were slightly more complicated. And she had been doing them honestly and well, and with the specific attention of someone who found genuine satisfaction in the precision of numbers. She was good at her work in the way that people who loved their work were good at it. And Kyle had noticed this before he noticed anything else about her. He had been in the restaurant that was the legitimate one for a meeting that had nothing to do with food, and she had been leaving as he arrived, arguing mildly with a coat check attendant about an umbrella that was not hers, but that had been given to her by mistake. And she had looked up from the argument and looked directly at him with an expression that was equal parts irritation and assessment, and had said, "Sorry, do you want to wait? Or do we do this the wrong way and both arrive at the dock the same time?" He had held the door. She had taken the correct umbrella. He had thought about her for 6 days before he found a reason to be back in the restaurant. 14 months of marriage, and he had thought he knew her. He had been as certain of this as he was certain of anything, and in his world, certainty was not a comfort. It was a tool. It was the thing you sharpened and maintained, because without it, you were dead or worse. He had been certain of Silas for 11 years. He had been certain of Lena for 14 months. He had been wrong about one of them, and he had taken 8 months to understand which one. And the 8 months had cost Lena everything that 8 months could cost a person. What Cale did not know on the Tuesday he signed the order that Lena was 8 weeks pregnant, that she had been planning to tell him that evening, at dinner, in the way she had been planning for 2 weeks, not dramatically, not with performance. In the direct way, she did everything. Across the table with the food getting cold and her hands around her wine glass and her eyes doing that thing they did when she was about to say something that mattered. He did not know because she never got to dinner. She was taken at 2 in the afternoon, before he had even come home. While she was at her desk in the home office, working on a set of quarterly reports, the order came with the speed and the silence that things in Cale's world moved when they were meant to be efficient. 3 people he trusted. Akar, a facility that was not a prison but that functioned as one. Managed by people who answered to Kyle and operated in the specific legal gray zone that money and connections could sustain for limited periods before requiring a more formal arrangement. What Kyle also did not know that at 7:53 that morning, before his world had changed, and before hers had changed, Lena had sent him an email. The subject line read something weird in the Q3 numbers, probably nothing but wanted to flag. The body of the email contained 3 paragraphs of careful accountant's language describing a discrepancy she had found in a set of financial documents that Cale had given her access to 6 months ago, when he had been trying to bring her closer to his world in the gradual, careful way he brought anything into the center of his life. She had not been looking for anything. She had been curious, in the way she was curious about numbers, and she had found something that did not add up, and she had flagged it the way she flagged everything that did not add up with precision, with the specific notation of a person who understood that a discrepancy at this level was almost always either an error or an intention, and that the difference between those 2 things mattered. The discrepancy was in a sub-account that funneled through 3 holding companies before arriving at a fund that was at the 6th degree of separation, connected to a name that Silas Drent had been very careful to keep at exactly that distance from anything Cale could read directly. Lena had not known any of this. She had only known that the number did not belong in the column it was in. She had sent the email. The email had been filtered by a spam algorithm that Silas managed as part of his oversight of internal communications. It had landed in a folder that Kyle never checked. It had sat there, unread, while the Tuesday happened, and the order was signed, and the world rearranged itself around a lie that a single email could have prevented. The facility Lena was taken to was in the outer suburbs, not uncomfortable in the physical sense, because Kyle had not been capable of ordering physical discomfort for her, even in the state he had been in, but a room with a lock on the outside and a guard who rotated every 6 hours and no ability to make calls to anyone who was not pre-approved, which was no one, because no one on the pre-approved list was told she was there. She was there for 3 weeks, before the facility's medical staff completed a standard health assessment and noted, in the clinical language of people who were paid to observe without judgment, that the detained individual appeared to be in the early stages of pregnancy and that a formal medical evaluation was recommended. The report went to a manager. The manager forwarded it to the facility director. The facility director was a careful man who understood that certain pieces of information required careful handling, and he made a decision that was motivated entirely by self-preservation. He did not forward the report to Kyle. He held it. He would hold it until the situation clarified. And by the time the situation clarified, when the formal legal pressure became sufficient to require Lena's transfer to a state facility, he had been holding it for 5 weeks. And the information had become inconvenient enough to warrant continued concealment. And Kale had never been told. What happened in the state facility was this: Lena Vasher spent 3 months in pre-trial detention while Kale's lawyers, who were not her lawyers, who had been instructed to manage the situation and not to clear it, built a case that turned out, in the hands of a judge who was not connected to Kyle's interests and an overworked public defender who was nevertheless competent, to be insufficient. The evidence that Silas had constructed was good. It was very good. But it had been constructed by a man who was meticulous about the larger picture and slightly less meticulous about the details at the edges. And the public defender, going through the financial records for the 16th time on a Sunday afternoon, found an edge, a timestamp discrepancy. The transfer that was supposed to have originated from Lena's account had a creation timestamp that preceded the account opening date by 11 hours, which was not possible and which the prosecution could not adequately explain, and which was enough. When presented with the right framing and the right expert witness, to create reasonable doubt in the mind of a judge who had been looking for a reason to be skeptical of a case that had always felt, to her experienced eye, slightly too constructed. Lena was acquitted at 23 weeks pregnant. She walked out of the courthouse on a November afternoon in a coat that no longer closed across the front, with the public defender's handshake and a bag containing the possessions she had been carrying when she was taken, and she stood on the courthouse steps for 60 seconds, doing something that was not quite breathing and not quite crying, and was perhaps the specific physiological response to a body that has been in crisis for 3 months and has just been told it is no longer required to perform crisis. Then she took out the phone from the bag. The battery was dead, and she flagged a cab and she went to the nearest hotel that had rooms available. And she charged the phone, and she looked at the screen when it came on, and she looked at the number that was not in her contacts anymore, because she had deleted it in the 3rd week of the facility. The number that was Kale's, and she did not call it. She had thought, during the 3 months, about what she would say when she called it. She had rehearsed the conversation in the dark of the cell. They had built it and rebuilt it and dismantled it the way she dismantled financial discrepancies, piece by piece, looking for the version that was true without being destroyed by it. She had arrived at the conclusion, sometime around the end of the 2nd month, that there was no such version, that the truest version of what had happened was also the most destructive, and that she did not have the capacity right now to hold both of those things at once. She put the phone down. She ordered food. She slept for 14 hours. Ren was born on a Friday in February in a hospital that was not connected to anyone Lena had ever known, in a city that was not Chicago and was not anywhere that Cale Morrow's organizational reach extended in the direct, immediate way that it extended to the places she had lived. The birth was not complicated in the medical sense. It was complicated in every other sense that a birth could be complicated, the sense of a woman who was doing this without a person she had planned to do it with, without the dinner conversation that was supposed to have happened in October, without the 14 months of marriage that had been the foundation she had built her understanding of the next years on. She held Ren for the first time and she thought you are the only thing from the last 6 months that I do not regret. She thought it with the specific clarity of a person who had had a great deal of time to locate their true feelings about various things, and she held it with both hands. She named the baby Ren because it was a name that did not have a history she was attached to and did not carry the weight of anyone else's expectations. And because when she said it in the hospital room alone at 2 a.m, it felt like the name of a person who was going to be exactly who they decided to be. She did not give the baby the last name Morrow. She gave the baby her own last name, the original one before the marriage. And she told herself this was practical, and then she told herself it was honest, and then she told herself it was none of anyone else's business. She built a life in 3 months. This was not as impossible as it sounded for someone who had spent 8 months before that being compressed into smaller and smaller spaces. The facility, the cell, the hospital room, the rented room with Ren, and who had found, through the compression, that what was essential was much smaller than she had previously calculated and much harder than she had expected. She found work remotely, consulting for a small accounting firm that asked no questions beyond the quality of the spreadsheets. She returned. She found an apartment in a city she had chosen by putting her finger on a map in a state she had never visited, specifically because it was not a place she had any connection to, and therefore not a place anyone would look for her connection to. She set up a life with the careful, deliberate precision of someone building something that needed to withstand a force she knew was coming. She did not know when. She did not know from which direction. She knew it was coming because she knew Cale Morrow. And the one thing she had never been wrong about regarding Cale Morrow was that he did not leave things unresolved. It was one of the things she had loved about him. It was one of the things she was most afraid of now. Ren was 6 months old, sitting in the specific, concentrated way of infants who have recently discovered that sitting is something their body can do and who find this deeply interesting. When the phone rang, Lena was at the kitchen table with a spreadsheet open on the laptop and Ren on a blanket 2 feet away. And the phone rang with a number that was not in her contacts because she had deleted it 8 months ago and had not re-added it because re-adding it would have meant something she was not ready for it to mean. She looked at the number. She looked at Ren, who was looking at the phone with the expression of someone who found all vibrating objects equally compelling. She looked at the number again. She let it ring. It rang 7 times and then stopped. And in the silence that followed, she sat at the kitchen table with the spreadsheet and the baby and the specific quality of a woman who has just been found but has not yet decided what to do about it. She picked up Ren from the blanket. She held him against her chest. She looked at the phone, which was not ringing anymore, and she thought about the Tuesday and the order and the fluorescent lights and the 14 months and the dinner that never happened. And she thought about all the things that had been taken and all the things that had been built in the space that was left. And she thought, I decide what happens next. Not him. Me. She put the phone face down on the table. She went back to the spreadsheet. She held Ren with one arm and typed with the other hand, in the specific, adaptive manner of a woman who had learned to do most things with one arm. And outside the window of the apartment in the city, she had chosen by pointing at a map. The evening arrived in the particular way. Evenings arrived in places where nobody knew your name, which was quietly and without obligation. She had kept the email, the original one, the one she had sent that Tuesday morning about the Q3 numbers. She had a copy of the sent folder on a personal drive she backed up obsessively. The habit of an accountant who had learned early that documentation was the difference between being believed and not being believed. In the facility, she had thought about that email. In the pre-trial detention, she had mentioned it to the public defender, who had requested the email records through discovery and had been told the email did not exist in the system. The public defender had noted this as anomalous. Lena had noted it as something else. She had held it the way she held all the things from that period, not with the intention of doing something about them immediately, but with the specific patience of someone who understood that time and clarity were the same tool used at different speeds, and that what felt impossible to address in November would look different in May. She was at May now. The email on the personal drive was one of 9 things she had in a folder she had titled, "With the dry specificity of her professional habits. Documentation." She had not opened the folder since February. She had not needed to yet, she thought, as she put Ren down for the evening and stood at the window of the apartment in the chosen city, that she was going to need to soon. Not because she wanted to, because the phone call that had not been answered had started a clock, and she understood clocks better than most people. And she knew that the one that had started tonight was not the kind you could ignore until it stopped. She called her sister, Mara, who was the only person who knew where she was. Mara lived in Portland and taught kindergarten, and had spent the first 4 months after Lena's acquittal in a state of barely contained fury on her sister's behalf that she had been managing. At Lena's request, into something more functional. He called. Lena said. Mara was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" I didn't answer. "Good. Is it?" Lena said. She sat on the edge of the couch with Ren's monitor on the cushion beside her. The small, moving, breathing shape on the screen. "I don't know what good means in this situation anymore," Mara said. "Good means you decide the terms, not him." Lena looked at the monitor. She said, "He's going to come regardless of whether I answer." "I know," Mara said. "So let him come on your ground. In your time. With your rules." Lena thought about this. "He doesn't do other people's rules very well," she said. Mara said, "He doesn't have a choice anymore." Lena thought about the order on the Tuesday and the lack of a question before it. And she thought about what it meant to not have a choice and whether that was ever entirely true for anyone. And she thought that the complexity of this was going to take longer than one phone call with Mara to resolve. "Okay," she said. "I'll think about it. Don't think too long." Mara said, "The longer he looks, the more tracks he makes. And tracks can be followed by people who aren't him." This was the most useful thing Mara said, because it was the thing Lena had been circling since she put the phone face down, that her own safety, and Ren's, was not only a question of Kyle finding her, but of who else might find her through the process of Kyle looking. He was not the only person in this story with a reason to know where she was. She had not fully articulated this yet, but she felt the shape of it. She sat with it until she was too tired to sit with it anymore, and then she went to bed. And she slept the way she had learned to sleep since February, lightly, with one ear always partially available. The sleep of someone who had learned to keep a portion of her attention on guard at all times, which was exhausting and was also the reason she was still here. She spent the following week doing 3 things simultaneously: managing the consulting work, caring for Ren, and quietly reorganizing her documentation. Not in a panicked way, she had made a specific decision. In the facility. That panic was a luxury she could not afford, and that the nearest functional substitute was methodical action. She reviewed the 9 items in the documentation folder. She added 2 more: the timestamp discrepancy that the public defender had found, which she had obtained a copy of through the court record, and a note she had written from memory about the specific wording of the Q3 email and what the discrepancy she had flagged had actually described. Because she had been going over it in her head since November, and she had arrived at a more specific understanding of what she had been looking at. She had not known, in October, that what she was looking at was the fingerprint of a man who had been stealing from K.L. Morrow's organization for an undetermined period through a series of sub-accounts. She knew it now. She had known it since the 3rd month in the facility. Sitting in the dark and running the numbers from memory, because she had nothing else to do and because running the numbers was the closest thing she had to control in a situation where she had none. She had the picture. She did not yet have the name. She had a strong suspicion and no way to verify it from where she was sitting, which was an apartment in a city where nobody knew her, and where the only connection she had to the world she had come from was the phone with the unanswered number and the documentation folder and the 6-month-old person who was, at this moment, pulling at the edge of her laptop with the determination of someone who had decided that whatever was on the screen was less interesting than what would happen if it fell off the table. "No," Lena said, moving the laptop. Ren looked at her with the expression of someone who had not yet accepted that no was a permanent condition. She looked back. She thought, "I know exactly how you feel." The second phone call came 4 days after the first. "Same number." She answered it. There was a pause. Surprise, she thought, registering with a specific satisfaction, and then his voice, which was the same as she remembered, and which she had specifically not allowed herself to remember in the last 8 months, because remembering it made it harder to do what she had needed to do. "Lena," he said, one word, her name, as if the word itself was the entire conversation he had prepared. She said, "Don't come here." He said, "I need to talk to you." She said, "I know." I said, "Don't come here. I'll send you an address. Public place. Daytime. You come alone." A pause. "All right," he said. She said, "I need 3 days." He said, "I've been looking for you for 6 weeks." She said, "You can wait 3 more days." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand, and she thought about his voice, and then she put the thought away in the specific compartment she had built for it. And she opened the documentation folder, and she looked at what she had, and she thought about what she was going to say when she walked into whatever public place she chose. And she thought that the most important thing was not what he said when he got there. The most important thing was what questions she asked first. Kyle Morrow had not slept properly in 6 weeks, which for a man whose relationship with sleep had always been functional rather than restorative, 4 hours minimum. 6, when the operational situation allowed. Never more. Because more was waste. Represented a specific category of dysfunction that he was not accustomed to. He had spent 15 years building something that required his clarity. And clarity was the one resource he had never had to worry about running out of. Because clarity had always come easily to him, in the way that certain things came easily to people who had organized their lives around a single, sustained direction. He had organized his life around the organization. The organization was the thing he woke up for, and the thing he managed, and the thing he protected. And then Lena Vasher had taken an umbrella argument at a coat check and looked at him without the calculation. And he had made the specific error of adding a second thing to the list of things he woke up for. And for 14 months, that had felt like the best decision he had made in 15 years. And for the 6 weeks following the moment he understood what he had done, he had not slept properly. This seemed like a reasonable consequence. This seemed, in fact, like the minimum reasonable consequence. The thing that had started it, the understanding. The beginning of the unraveling had come not from inside his organization, but from outside it. A lawyer named Petra Cohn, who had represented Lena during the pre-trial detention, had filed a complaint with the state bar 6 months after the acquittal. Not a criminal complaint, a procedural one, about the conduct of the evidence chain in the original case, specific and technical, and the kind of complaint that generated paperwork rather than headlines. The paperwork had moved through channels in the slow way paperwork moved, and it had eventually crossed the desk of a journalist named Farrow, who covered organized crime for a Chicago outlet, and who had a specific, long-standing interest in the way that money and legal process interacted in the gray zone that Cale's world occupied. Farrow had contacted Petra. Petra had given him the hashed outline of the case, Not specific enough to be actionable, specific enough to be interesting. Farrow had started writing. One of Cale's people, who monitored certain journalists as a matter of operational protocol, had flagged the story before it ran. Cale had bought the story, not the journalist, who was principled in the way that made buying impractical. But the publication's ownership, through a chain of transactions that took 9 days and cost more than the story was worth by any standard metric. He had done it before he had fully understood why he needed to do it. He had done it on instinct, and instinct was the thing he trusted when analysis was too slow. And this time, instinct had been the thing that cracked the case open. Because buying the story meant reading the story. And reading the story meant reading the hashed outline of the evidence chain. And reading the evidence chain meant seeing, for the first time, the thing that he had not permitted himself to see in the 3 a.m. of the Tuesday, when the folder was in front of him and the pen was in his hand. The timestamp discrepancy. The transfer that had apparently originated from Lena's account, but that bore a creation timestamp 11 hours before the account it was supposedly sent from, had been opened. Kyle was not a financial expert. He was, however, a man who had spent 15 years operating in the space where financial records were routinely constructed and deconstructed for specific purposes. And he understood, with the specific intelligence of someone who had used these tools rather than merely studied them, that a timestamp discrepancy of this kind was not an oversight. Oversights produced errors in amounts, in account numbers, in routing codes. They did not produce timestamps that preceded the existence of the accounts they referenced, because the system would not allow it, because the system flagged impossible dates, which meant the timestamp was not an error. It was a construction artifact. Someone had built the transfer record, and they had built it in a hurry, or with insufficient attention to the specific detail of when the account it referenced had actually been opened, and in that insufficient attention, they had left a thread. Cale pulled the thread for 6 weeks before he found what was at the other end of it. Finding it required a set of skills he did not have personally, and a level of discretion that narrowed his usable resources to 4 people. He used 2 of them, Petra's file, through a private channel, and a forensic accountant in London who asked no questions and whose fee reflected both the work and the silence. What the forensic accountant found, working through the financial architecture that Silas Drent had been building for an unspecified period with the precision of a man who was very good at his work. There was a series of sub-accounts, moving money through 3 shell companies and arriving eventually in a fund that was registered in a name that Cale did not recognize, but that the forensic accountant was able, through a cross-reference of registered agents, to connect to a holding company whose board included, at 2 removes, a name that Cale recognized with the specific, cold recognition of a man whose entire body understood the information before his mind had finished processing it. He sat with the forensic accountant's report for 4 hours without doing anything. This was unusual for him. He was a man who processed information quickly and moved on it quickly. Because in his world, the time between knowing and acting was the time during which you could be killed. He sat for 4 hours because what he was processing was not tactical information. What he was processing was the specific weight of 11 years of trust, being rearranged into something that was not trust at all, but that had worn its shape for so long that the shape was still there after the content had been removed, like the ghost outline of furniture in a room that had been emptied. He thought about Silas at 3 a.m. with the folder. He thought about himself reaching for the pen. He thought about the email Petra's complaint had mentioned an email, a sent message that the evidence chain had claimed did not exist. And Cale thought about what email Lena might have sent on the morning of a Tuesday in October when the world had not yet ended, and what it might have contained. And he thought that the answer to that question was the one thing that confirmed everything else. And he thought that he needed to find it before he could go to her. Because he was not going to go to her with a theory. He was going to go with proof. He found the email on day 43 of the 6 weeks. It was in a spam folder on a server that Silas administered. In a subfolder labeled with an innocuous system designation that was the kind of label a man used when he wanted something to be findable by him and unfindable by anyone else. Kale's man, going through the server with the painstaking attention of someone who had been told that a specific email existed and that it needed to be found. Found it in 11 hours. The email was dated the morning of the Tuesday. The subject line, something weird in the Q3 numbers, probably nothing but wanted to flag. The body was 3 paragraphs of careful, precise accountant's language describing a discrepancy in a sub-account at a level of the organization's financial architecture that Lena should not, technically, have been able to see, except that Kale had given her access 6 months before, gradually, because he had been trying to bring her closer and because he had trusted her. The discrepancy she had described, the number that did not belong in the column it was in, was the fingerprint of Silas's extraction, rendered visible by the specific attention of a woman who had been given access to financial records and had noticed, because she was very good at noticing, that something was wrong. She had noticed it before the attack. She had flagged it. She had sent the email. And the email had gone nowhere, because the server it passed through was managed by the man whose theft it would have exposed. Kyle read the email 3 times. He put the phone down. He thought about what he had done, and he thought about what it had cost, and he thought that there was no calculation available to him in this or any other moment that produced an outcome in which what he had done was proportionate to the evidence he had had when he did it, or was survivable for Lena, in any sense that made the word survivable mean what it was supposed to mean. He picked the phone back up. He called the number he had for her, not the number she had before, a number he had found through 6 weeks of looking. It rang 7 times. She did not answer. He found the city 4 days before she called him back. He did not find the building. She had been careful enough about that, which told him something about what she had become in 8 months, which was a version of the person he had married that had been run through a process he had put her in and had come out with specific, hard-edged capabilities she had not previously needed. He knew the city, and he had people moving through it carefully, looking without announcing, and then she called. And her voice on the phone was the voice. He remembered, except that it was different in the specific way that a person's voice was different when they had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had reorganized their body around the weight of it. She told him not to come. She told him she would send an address. She told him to come alone. He said he would. He meant it. He was many things he was not proud of in this specific period of his life, but he was not going to arrive with people at a meeting she had asked him to come to alone, because whatever control he had left over the situation consisted entirely of not making it worse. He had already made it as bad as it could be. He was not going to add to it. He told 2 people where he was going and asked them to tell no one else. He specifically did not tell Silas, which was the first time in 11 years he had withheld operational information from Silas, and the withholding felt like lowering a blade rather than raising one, the specific sensation of a weapon that cuts on the way down as well as the way up. He had been withholding from Silas for 6 weeks, feeding him ordinary operational information while keeping the investigation entirely separated. Using channels Silas did not monitor and resources Silas did not know he had access to. He had been good at this. He was surprised to find he was good at it. He had thought that the hardest part of the last 6 weeks would be the investigation itself. But the hardest part had been sitting across from Silas at the operational table twice a week and looking at the man with the same quality of attention he had been looking at him with for 11 years, giving nothing away. He had managed it because he had needed to manage it. and because the alternative moving against Silas before he had complete and irrefutable proof was the same error he had made with Lena, and he was not going to make that error again. Not with anyone. Not ever. He had paid too much to learn it. While Kyle moved through his 6 weeks of investigation and careful, surgical concealment, Lena was building. This was the thing he did not know and would not know until later, that the woman he was looking for was not waiting. She had not been waiting since the facility. She had been constructing, with the same methodical precision she applied to financial records, a life that did not depend on him finding her or not finding her, a life that was hers regardless of the outcome of whatever was coming. The consulting work paid enough. The apartment was sufficient. Ren was thriving in the specific, concentrated way of infants who were receiving complete attention from a person whose love for them was uncomplicated by anything else. Mara called every 3 days. The documentation folder had grown to 14 items. Lena had not yet determined what she was going to do with it, whether it was evidence for a confrontation, protection for herself, or something else she had not yet named. She thought of it as a tool without a decided purpose, which was the most honest way to describe most of what she was holding right now. She chose the park because it was public, and because it had 3 exits she had memorized, and because there was a coffee cart near the south end where a woman named Daria worked every morning and who had, over 6 weeks of daily visits, become someone who knew Lena's order and her approximate schedule, and who would, Lena thought, remember seeing her if she needed to be remembered. She texted the address to Kale on a Thursday, and she spent the 2 days before the meeting doing the specific preparation of someone who was not going to walk into a conversation with the man who had signed the order without being fully organized. She reviewed the documentation folder. She practiced the 3 questions in the order she intended to ask them. She arranged for her friend Daria, who did not know any of the context and did not need to be standing 15 meters away with her phone at the time the meeting was scheduled. Not as protection, not as a witness in any formal sense, but because Lena had learned in 8 months that having a person in proximity who would notice if she disappeared was a basic operational requirement of being alive. She did not think Kale would do anything to her. She also did not think, a year ago, that Kyle would sign an order without asking her a single question. And she had been wrong about that. She was not going to be wrong about preparation. The morning of the meeting, she dressed with the same care she applied to everything since February, not to be impressive, not for him, but because the act of deliberate self-presentation was one of the small forms of control that was completely hers and that no one could take from her without her permission. She wore clothes that were hers, in the specific sense of having been purchased with money she had earned, and chosen with preferences that were entirely her own, and not organized around anyone else's aesthetic or expectations. She put Ren in the stroller with the specific efficiency of a woman who had gotten very fast at the mechanics of infant management. She pushed the stroller to the park. She positioned herself at the bench. She had chosen the one with the clearest sightlines to all 3 exits, and she waited. She did not feel afraid. She had been afraid in the facility and in the pre-trial detention and in the hospital and for the first 2 months afterward, and she had run through what felt like a lifetime of fear in those 8 months. And what was on the other side of it was not fearlessness, exactly, but a specific quality of readiness that was different from fear in the way that knowing something was coming was different from being surprised by it. She had known this was coming since she put the phone face down on the table. She was ready. She watched the park entrance, and she waited. And Ren sat in the stroller and looked at the trees with the profound attention of someone for whom trees were still new. And she thought that of all the things she wanted from the next hour, the most important was to get through it, without Ren ever knowing it had been hard. Kael came through the south entrance at exactly the time she had specified. She saw him from 50 meters, which was far enough that she had a moment before he saw her. And she used the moment to do the assessment she had been preparing to do, not emotionally, not sentimentally, just as information. He looked the same in the essential ways and different in the specific ones. The same posture, the same quality of presence that arrived before he did. The quality that had been the first thing she had registered about him before she knew his name. Different in the way that people who had been carrying something heavy looked different, a compression around the jaw. A quality of watchfulness that was more active than his usual watchfulness, which was already substantial. He had not slept. She could tell from the distance, which told her something about how long he had not been sleeping. He walked through the park with the specific quality of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was allowing himself to appear to not be certain, which was Cale's version of being casual. And she thought that some things were exactly the same and that she was going to have to be careful about that. She looked at Ren. She looked back at the south entrance. She waited for him to find her. She was not going to make it easy by standing up. He would find her. He was Cale Morrow, and he would find her. She just did not need to perform finding for him. He found her in 45 seconds. He crossed the distance between the entrance and the bench, and he stopped 6 feet from her, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. And then he looked at Ren, who looked back at him with the direct, unself-conscious gaze of a 6-month-old for whom all faces were equally interesting and equally available for study. And what happened to his face in that moment was the most unmanaged thing she had ever seen from a man who had spent his entire adult life managing. It was not a small thing. She registered it without comment. He sat down on the bench, not beside her, at the other end, with Ren's stroller between them, and he said nothing for a moment. And she did not prompt him, because she had 3 questions to ask, and she was not going to waste the moment on anything that wasn't the questions. She said, "Before you say anything, I want to ask you 3 things." He looked at her. He nodded. She said, "Did you read the file before you signed?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you ask me?" He held her gaze. "No," he said. She said, "Did you know I was pregnant?" He said, "No." 3 answers. She sat with them. She had known the answers, had known them in the abstract sense that she had run through this conversation 400 times in the last 8 months, but hearing them in his voice, in this park, with Ren between them, examining a leaf with surgical focus, was different from knowing them in the dark of a cell. She said, "That's what I thought." She said nothing else. She waited. What Cale said. After the silence she gave him, and after the silence he took a moment longer than she expected, was this. "The email. You sent an email that morning about a discrepancy in the Q3 numbers." She looked at him. He said, "I found it 6 weeks ago, on a server that Silas manages." She did not say anything immediately. She had known there was an email. She had been the one to send it. But the fact that he had found it, that he had been looking, that he had dug through Silas's servers looking for a Tuesday morning email from a woman he had put in a cell arrived with a weight she had not calculated for. "What did you do with it?" she said. He said, "I have a forensic accountant working on the financial architecture behind the discrepancy you flagged. I have a document trail that goes 6 layers deep and arrives at a name I think you've probably arrived at yourself." She looked at him steadily. "Silas," she said, not a question. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. She said, "I worked it out from memory in the 2nd month. I didn't have the account numbers, but I had the structure. I knew what I'd been looking at when I sent the email. I just hadn't understood what it was at the time." He said, "You knew before I did." She said, "I had more time than you to think." The statement was precise, and she did not modulate it, and he received it without flinching, which she noted. He said, "What are you going to do with what you have?" she said. I was asking myself the same question about what you are going to do with what you have. He said, I'm going to remove him. She said, remove? He said, yes. The word was the specific vocabulary of his world, and they both knew what it meant, and neither of them looked away from it. She said, and then, he said, and then I want to talk about everything else. She looked at Ren, who had discarded the leaf and was now regarding the world with the expression of someone considering their next project. She said, you don't get to determine the order. He said, I know. She said, I'll be in touch. She stood up and straightened the stroller, and she began to push it toward the east exit. And behind her she heard him say, very quietly, the way he said things, he was not managing, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I'm going to say it anyway. She kept walking. She did not look back. She did not cry. Because she had used all of those tears in November, and what was left was more structural than that. She pushed the stroller to the east exit and out of the park, and she walked 3 blocks to the coffee cart where Daria was working, and he ordered her tea, and she let Daria make a face at Ren. And she stood in the November morning and she thought about remove and then, and I'm sorry. And she thought about what she was going to do with all of that, and she did not know yet. And not knowing yet was the most honest position she had, and she was going to stay in it until something shifted. She called Mara that evening. She told her about the park and the 3 questions, and Silas and the remove and the I'm sorry. Mara listened to all of it and said, how do you feel Lena thought about this question seriously? The way she thought about things that deserved serious thought. She said, I feel like a building that's been through a structural event and is still standing and doesn't know yet what it's capable of holding. Mara was quiet for a moment. She said, that's either a hopeful metaphor or a very concerning one. Lena said, I know. That's why I'm not drawing conclusions yet. Mara said, what are you going to do? Lena said, I'm going to watch what he does. Not what he says. What he does. Mara said, and if what he does is everything he said, Lena looked at Ren asleep on the monitor. She said, then I'll decide what that means. Not before. Mara said, okay. Lena said, okay. They said goodnight, and she put the phone down, and she sat in the quiet of the apartment in the city she had chosen by pointing at a map, and she thought about the park bench, and the south entrance, and the east exit, and the 3 answers, and the I'm sorry, and the way he had looked at Ren, which was the thing she had not mentioned to Mara, and was not going to mention to anyone yet. Because some things needed to remain entirely her own until she understood what to do with them. He called 3 days later not to find her location, not to push the meeting into something it was not, but with a specific piece of information that he delivered in the flat. Factual manner. She recognized as the way he delivered things, he considered essential and not open to interpretation. He said, the forensic accountant found a secondary account. Silas has been building an exit structure for 14 months, starting approximately 2 months before the attack on the warehouse. He was planning to leave before the attack happened. The attack, and your arrest, appear to have been the mechanism he used to buy himself additional time and to create enough chaos in the organization to cover the final phase of the extraction. She listened. She said, how much? He said, enough. The word landed with the weight of someone who had run the number and found it corrosive. She said, when are you moving against him? He said, as soon as the evidentiary chain is complete enough to be irrefutable. I made an error once by acting on insufficient evidence. I won't do it again. The sentence hung in the air between them with the specific quality of something said out loud that was being said. At the same time, directly to her. She did not comment on it. She said, what do you need from me? He said, Your email, the original sent copy, with the metadata intact. It establishes that you identified the discrepancy before the attack and reported it, and that the report was suppressed. It closes the evidentiary circle on Silas's intent. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the documentation folder. She thought about the 14 items, built with patience and precision over 8 months. She said, "I'll send it to you. Through a channel you won't be able to trace back to my location." He said, "I know." She said, "You're not going to try to trace it." "No," he said. She said, "I need to hear you say that clearly." He said, "I will not use the email transmission to locate you. I'll tell my people the same." She said, "All right." She sent the email that evening through a routing method she had researched and implemented herself, with the satisfaction of someone who had learned competencies in the last 8 months that she had not previously required. She sent it, and she closed the laptop, and she sat in the quiet apartment, and she thought that the thing she was doing, cooperating with the man who had put her in a cell, providing evidence that would help him dismantle the person who had actually been responsible, was either the most practical thing she had ever done, or a form of something she did not have a comfortable name for, and that the difference between those two things was going to become clearer as the situation developed. She looked at Ren on the monitor. She thought, "I decide what this means. Not the situation. Not him. Me." She turned off the light. She did not hear from him for 11 days after sending the email. She did not reach out. The 11 days were a test she did not announce, and he did not know he was taking. She was watching whether he used the silence to push, to appear with more people than agreed, to position himself in a way that prioritized his operational needs over her stated terms. He did none of these things. On the 8th day, Mara called to say that a mutual acquaintance who had nothing to do with Kyle's world had asked about Lena in the way people asked when someone had suggested the asking. And Lena spent 20 minutes thinking about whether this was Kale or Silas and concluded, based on the acquaintance and the nature of the question and the timing, that it was Silas, that Silas had noticed something moving in his peripheral vision and was running a broader search pattern to understand what and where. She texted Kyle, "Your timeline needs to move faster. Someone is looking for me who is not you." He replied, "In 4 minutes, I know. We move tomorrow." She put the phone down. She looked at Ren, who was attempting to navigate the transition from sitting to crawling, and who was approaching the problem with the specific, focused determination she had observed in him since birth, and that she had decided, privately, she would never tell him came from his father. She moved Ren slightly so that the direction of attempted travel did not end at the table leg. She waited. She spent the following 3 days doing the things she had learned to do while waiting, working, caring for Ren, not thinking about the thing she was waiting for, by thinking very specifically about other things. She reorganized the documentation folder. She completed a set of quarterly reports for the consulting client that were the best work she had produced for them, which she attributed to the specific focus that came from needing to put her attention somewhere that was not the Kale situation. She took Ren to the park, a different park, on the other side of the city, and she sat on a bench and watched him in the stroller with a quality of attention that was both ordinary and extraordinary. The attention of a woman who understood that the person in the stroller was the most load-bearing element in the structure of her current life, and that this was not a problem but the most clarifying fact she had encountered in years. She thought about the documentation folder and the email and Silas and the tomorrow that had already passed. She thought about the "I'm sorry" in the park and what she was going to do with it. And she thought that she still did not know. And that not knowing was not a failure of processing, but the honest position of someone who had not yet received all the information she needed to make a decision. She was waiting for the rest of the information. She would make the decision when she had it. She pushed the stroller home. The park meeting had been a Wednesday, the Saturday after it. When Ren was 7 months old and beginning to demonstrate an opinion about which foods he preferred and which he would tolerate with visible reluctance. Lena opened her laptop and looked at the documentation folder and added a 15th item, a note about the park, dated and time-stamped, describing the meeting and the 3 questions and the 3 answers and the "I'm sorry." She added it not because she needed to document the meeting in any legal or evidentiary sense, but because she was an accountant and accountants wrote things down. And writing things down was how she processed them, and she needed to process the park. What she noted in the 15th item was not emotional analysis, it was factual, in the specific way her notes always were, but the facts, when listed, had a quality she had not anticipated, which was that they told a story that was different from the story she had been telling herself for 8 months. The story she had been telling herself for 8 months was a story about a man who had made a catastrophic choice without thinking. The story the park notes were telling her was a story about a man who had been carrying that catastrophic choice for 6 weeks while simultaneously building a case to undo the consequences of it, who had come to a public park alone on her terms and answered 3 questions without deflection or defense, who had said he was sorry in a way that contained no request for anything in return. She did not know what to do with the difference between those 2 stories. She closed the laptop. She thought about it for 4 days. On the 4th day she called him. He answered on the first ring. She said, "I want to know what you're doing about Silas." He said, "We moved on him 3 days ago." She said, "How?" He said, "A conversation." Recorded. He said what he needed to say, to confirm what I already knew. After that it was managed in the way things are managed in this world. And the details are the kind you don't want, and I'm not going to give you. She thought about this for a moment. She said, "Is it complete?" He said, "It's complete." She said, "And the evidence? What you have? Is it enough to clear the record?" He said. "My attorney is filing with the court this week. The original case is going to be formally vacated. It will take 4 to 6 weeks through the judicial process, but it's done in every sense that matters." She sat with this. She thought about vacated the specific legal weight of a case being declared null, the specific weight of her name in a record being struck. She said, "What about the financial damage? What Silas took?" He said, "That's an organizational matter, separate from what happened to you." She said, "I know it's separate. I'm asking because I want to understand the full picture." He said, "It's being recovered. Not fully. Some of it moved to jurisdictions where recovery is impractical. Enough of it is recoverable, but the organization's position is stable." She said, "Okay." She said, "One more thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "The facility, the people who ran it, the director who knew I was pregnant and didn't tell you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's being addressed." She said, "Addressed?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I want it to mean that it can't happen to anyone else. Not just consequence for the people involved. Structural change." He was quiet for longer this time. He said, "All right." She said, "I mean it. I need to know it means something beyond this situation." He said, "I understand what you're asking." She said, "Do you?" He said, "You're asking me to change how I operate, not just in this situation, in the category of situations." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to need some time with that." She said, "I know. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm asking for it to be in the list of things you're thinking about." He said, "It's in the list." She said, "All right." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand, and she thought about structural change and whether she believed him, and whether belief was the right metric at this stage, or whether watching was. She thought it was watching. She put the phone down. "Ren," from the blanket. made a sound that was not a word, but had the cadence of an opinion, and she looked at him, and she said, "I know. I'm figuring it out." He looked at her with the expression that said he was reserving judgment. 2 weeks after the park meeting, on a day when the forensic accountant's final report had been filed and the attorney's motion to vacate had been submitted to the court, and Silas Drent had ceased to be a variable in any of Kyle's or Lena's equations, Kyle drove to the city she was in. He had not announced this. He did not know exactly where she was. He had her general location and the area of the city from the months of looking, but not the specific address. And he had kept that boundary deliberately because she had drawn it, and he was not going to cross it without invitation. He drove to the city because he needed to be closer to the situation, and he did not know how to ask to be closer. And this was the specific limitation of his emotional architecture that he was aware of in the way that people were aware of structural problems they had been living with long enough to accommodate without solving. He drove and he found a hotel on the north side of the city, and he called her from the hotel room at 9 in the evening and said, "I'm in your city. I'm not going to look for you. I want you to know I'm here if you want to talk. I'll leave tomorrow if you don't." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why?" he said. "Because doing it from Chicago felt like the wrong distance." She thought about that. She said, "Go to the park. The one from the meeting. Tomorrow at 10. He said, "All right." She said, "Bring coffee. There's a cart at the south entrance." He said, "What do you take?" She said, "You remember." He was quiet for a moment. "Oat milk. 1, sugar. Always too hot." He said. She said, "Yes." She hung up. She sat with the phone and she thought about a man who had driven to her city and gotten a hotel room and called instead of appearing at her door. And she thought about what kind of man that was. And she thought that it was a different kind of man from the one who had signed the order on a Tuesday. And she thought about whether different was enough. And she thought that she still did not know. And that the park tomorrow would tell her something she didn't have yet. And that something was worth showing up for. She arrived at the park at 9:50 with Wren in the stroller, and she found him at the south entrance coffee cart at 9:55, which meant he had been there before 9:55, because he was the kind of person who was always at things before the designated time when the things mattered to him. He had 2 cups. He handed her the right one without a word. She took it. They walked. She did not sit on the bench from the first meeting, because she did not want to sit on the bench from the first meeting. She wanted to be moving, because moving made the conversation less final at each step. And she was not ready for final. They walked the perimeter of the park, and Wren looked at everything with the profound attention he gave all things, and KL walked at her pace, which was slightly different from his natural pace in the specific way of someone consciously adjusting. She noticed this and did not comment on it. She said, "Tell me about the first 6 weeks. What you were doing," he told her. He told her about Petra's complaint and the journalist and the story he had bought and the timestamp discrepancy and the forensic accountant. He told it in the flat, factual way. He told things that were operational, and she listened the way. She listened to financial presentations with attention to both the content and the structure, looking for what was there and what was conspicuously not there. What was conspicuously not, there was any attempt to make himself look better. He did not emphasize how fast he had moved once he understood. He did not minimize how long it had taken him to understand. He said, "I should have seen it before Tuesday. The evidence was constructed well, but not perfectly. I signed without looking for the imperfections, because I was in a state where looking for imperfections felt like defending something I didn't want to defend." She said, "You mean you were angry?" He said, "I was in a state that I called anger and that I think was closer to grief. The grief of someone who had been given access to something they'd spent 15 years deciding not to have, and who was suddenly presented with what felt like evidence that the decision had been right all along. She looked at him. She said, "You mean me?" He said, "I mean trusting someone. You, specifically." "Yes, but the act of it. I built the thing I built, partly by not doing that. And when it appeared to go wrong, it confirmed the part of me that had always said not to." She walked in silence for a moment. She said, "I'm not responsible for your relationship with trust." He said, "No, I know." She said, "I'm not something you get credit for having tried." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I'm saying it out loud because I need to hear that you know it." He said, "I know it. What happened to you was because of what I did with my own fear. That's not something you were part of. That was mine." She looked at the park in the morning light. She looked at Ren. She thought about mine and the specific weight of a person claiming the correct thing as theirs. And she thought that this was different from the apology in the first meeting, and that different was information. She said, "Ren." He said, "Yes." She said, "He doesn't know who you are." He said, "I know." She said, "He's 7 months old. The window for introductions at this age is probably not developmentally significant." He said, "Is that your way of saying?" She said, "Stop. I'm saying I think he should know who you are. In time. On a timeline that I control and that you agree to in advance, with terms that we both understand." He said, "What are the terms?" She said, "You come when I say. Not when you want. You leave when I say. You don't make promises to him that are bigger than the visit you're in. And you understand that my decision to allow this is not a decision about us. It's a decision about him." He said, "Yes." She said, "Those are the terms." He said, "I agree to them." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. She said, "Kyle." He looked at her. She said, "He looks like you." It was not said warmly. It was not said coldly. It was said the way she said things that were simply true and that required saying, with the precision of a woman who had learned, in 8 months of necessary directness, that the truth stated plainly was almost always more useful than the truth managed. He looked at Ren in the stroller. Ren looked back at him with the specific focused gaze he turned on all faces, the gaze of someone taking inventory. Kale said, very quietly, "I know." She said, "You can say hello." He crouched down to the stroller, which was something she had not seen him do before, and he said, "Hello, Ren." And Ren looked at him for a long moment, with the gravity of someone being introduced to a concept rather than a person. And then Ren reached out one hand toward Kale's face with the exploratory instinct of infants for whom the world was composed entirely of things to be assessed by touch. And Kale held very still and let Ren's hand arrive at his jaw, and he held very still for the duration. And when Ren withdrew the hand and returned to his assessment of the general environment, Kale straightened and looked at Lena, and she saw that the management was completely gone from his expression, and what was there instead was something she had no established category for, and that she thought she was going to need to build one. She looked away. She started walking again. He fell into step beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. The park held them in its November quiet, and the coffee was still warm, and Ren observed the world from the stroller with his characteristic authority. And Lena thought about terms and timelines and decisions about him and decisions about us. And she thought that those were 2 separate columns in the ledger, and that she was going to maintain the separation for as long as she needed to. And she thought that she did not know yet how long that was going to be, and that not knowing was all right. At the end of the walk, at the east exit, she stopped and turned, and she said, "I found out what the discrepancy was, from memory, in the 2nd month. I knew what Silas had done before you did. I had no way to do anything about it, and so I kept it in my head, and I waited. What I want to know is what you did with that information when you found it. Not operationally. What you did with it inside yourself. He was quiet for a moment. That was the specific length of a moment where a person was choosing between the answer they had prepared and the true one. He said, I understood that I had done the worst thing I had ever done to another person. Not in the category of my work. Not in the operational sense, in the personal sense. In the sense of someone who had been trusted and had burned it. I understood that this was not the same as the other things I had done in my life that I was not proud of. Because the other things were in a category of consequences that I had accepted as part of the life I had chosen, and that the people affected had, in some way, signed up to be adjacent to. You had not signed up for this. You had signed up for me, specifically, and I had used that trust to destroy you with it. And the understanding of that was... He stopped. She waited. He said, It is the thing I get up in the morning now living with. She looked at him for a long time. She said, Okay. She did not say anything else. She turned and pushed the stroller through the east exit, and she walked 3 blocks to the coffee cart. And she ordered another tea from Daria, who made a face at Ren and asked how the morning had been. And she said, Fine. And Daria said good. And that was the entire extent of the commentary available to her about the morning. And she thought that was probably appropriate. She texted Mara Park went okay. Mara texted back, Define okay. She thought about it for a minute. She texted, He's doing the right things. I don't know what it means yet. Mara texted, That's enough for today. Lena looked at the message. She thought, yes, that's enough for today. She put the phone in her pocket and pushed the stroller home. She did not see him for 10 days after the second park meeting. He called once, 4 days in, not to push anything, but to say that the motion to vacate had been accepted by the court and the formal process was moving ahead on schedule, and that his attorney would be reaching out to her attorney she had acquired. One since February. A quiet woman in the chosen city who asked the right questions and listened well to coordinate the documentation. She thanked him and ended the call. She thought about the word thanked and whether it was the right word, and concluded it was the available word, which was not the same thing, but was what she had. She spent the 10 days working on the consulting accounts and taking Ren to the park in the mornings and calling Mara and reviewing the documentation folder, which she had stopped adding to because she had run out of new information to add, and because adding to it had always been a way of processing things and what she needed. To process now was not information, but something else, something without a column heading. She thought about the things he had said in the second park walk, and she thought about what she was going to do with them, and she thought that what she was going to do was wait until she stopped analyzing them and started feeling them, and then decide. She was not there yet. She was still analyzing. She was all right with that. On the 11th day he called and said, Silas had people. Not many, but some. They've been looking for you through channels I'm not in control of. She said, How active is the looking? He said, Active enough that I think you should consider moving. She said, I'm not going to move because of someone else's agenda. That's what I've been doing for 8 months. He said, I know. I'm not asking you to move for someone else's agenda. I'm asking you to consider it as a security measure for you and Ren. She thought about this. She said, What are the specific risks? He told her. She listened carefully. She asked 3 questions about the nature of Silas's network and how much of it remained operational after what Cale had done. He answered all 3. She said, What would you recommend? He said, Come back to Chicago. I have the capacity to keep you safe there, in a way I can't manage from this distance. She was quiet for a moment. She said, You understand what you're asking? He said, I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to make a choice that's about safety and not about anything else. And I'm telling you that if you make that choice, I will not interpret it as anything other than what it is," she said. "And what about what it is from my side?" He said. "That's your calculation to make. I'm giving you the security information. The rest is yours." She thought for a long time. She thought about the chosen city and the apartment, and Daria at the coffee cart, and the park with its 3 exits, and the east exit she always used, and the life she had built with the careful precision of someone constructing something that needed to withstand a force. She thought about whether that force was coming from outside regardless of where she was, and whether the question was therefore not whether to move, but where to move. She said, "I need to think about it." He said, "Of course." He did not press. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she made the call that moved the situation into its next phase, not because she had forgiven him, not because she had decided anything about what they were, but because she was a woman who made practical decisions, and the practical decision, when she ran the numbers, was the one she did not prefer, and that she was going to make anyway. Because she had learned in 8 months that the decisions you didn't prefer were often the ones that were right. She packed the apartment in 3 days, which was faster than she would have expected, and which was possible because she had not accumulated much in the chosen city, which was consistent with having chosen it as a temporary structure rather than a permanent one. She did not say goodbye to Daria, because saying goodbye would have required explanation, and explanation was not possible. But she left a note under the coffee cart with her regular morning order times written on a piece of paper and the words, "Thank you," the kind of thanks that covered more than the tea. She drove to Chicago in a car she rented under a name that was valid and that was hers. She had kept the original name after February, kept all her own names, given them all back to herself in the courthouse, and she arrived at an address Cale had sent her, which was an apartment in a building she had never seen, on the north side of Chicago, 3 floors up, with windows that faced south and a second bedroom that had been painted, she discovered when she opened the door and walked in a color that was the specific pale yellow of sunlight through a window on a good morning in October. Not the original October, a different kind. She stood in the doorway of the second bedroom and looked at the paint on the walls, and she thought about who had made that decision, and when, and she thought that the answer to that question was also information, and that she was going to file it carefully in the column it belonged in. She put Wren down on the blanket, she spread on the living room floor, and she stood at the south window, and she looked at Chicago, which she had last seen from a courthouse step in November, with a coat that did not close and a bag of possessions she had been carrying when she was taken. And she thought here again. Different. Let's see what that means. Cale called that evening. He said, "You're in the apartment." She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you need anything?" She said, "I need you to tell me what the terms are. For me, being in Chicago, for you having proximity, what do you think this means, and what do you want from it?" He said, "I want you to be safe. Beyond that, I want whatever you decide, on whatever timeline you set, in whatever form you determine is appropriate. I have no other agenda." She said, "That's a very clean answer for a complicated situation." He said, "I know. I'm giving you the cleanest version because the complicated version is mine to carry, not yours to manage." She looked at the south window. She said, "You had the second bedroom painted." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes." She said, "Yellow." He said, "I looked at what colors were used in rooms for infants. Most of them were too saturated. Yellow was the one that seemed right for the light in that room in the morning." She thought about the forensic attention applied to choosing the color of a room for a child he had not met until a park bench. And she thought about what kind of calculation that was and what column it went in, and she thought that the columns were getting more complicated by the day, and that this was probably appropriate given the situation. She said, "Thank you for the apartment." He said, "It's yours for as long as you need it. There's no condition attached to it." She said, "I know." She said goodnight, and she put the phone down, and she sat in the Chicago apartment with the south-facing windows and the yellow second bedroom. And I thought about all of it, the Tuesday, and the order, and the cell, and the courthouse, and the chosen city, and the park, and the 2 walks, and the coffee, from the right cart, and the "I'm sorry" that didn't ask for anything, and the yellow paint, and the forensic attention brought to a color, and she thought that she was not ready to draw conclusions. And she thought that she was closer to ready than she had been a month ago, and she thought that closer was enough for tonight. She listened to Ren breathing in the next room, in the pale, yellow morning light room, and she thought, this is the thing I'm building. Everything else gets to wait for me to decide about it. She turned off the living room light, and she went to bed in a city she had not chosen this time, but that she knew. And the knowing felt, in some specific way, she was not going to name yet, like something other than a problem. She had been in the Chicago apartment for 4 days when Kyle came to see her. Not to the apartment. He had not been to the apartment, and she had not invited him. And he understood the difference between proximity and invitation, and he was honoring it. He came to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the building, and she came to meet him because she had initiated the meeting. Because there was something she needed to say that she had not been ready to say in the park, and that she had spent 2 weeks getting ready for. She came without Ren, which was the first time she had come to a meeting with him without Ren between them in some sense. And she noticed that she had made this choice, and she thought about what it meant. She sat across from him in the coffee shop, which was not the kind of coffee shop you chose for a casual meeting. It was quiet, and in the middle of the morning, and almost empty. And she said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to not respond immediately. I need you to hear all of it first." He said, "All right," she said. "In the facility, in the 2nd month, I decided I hated you. I decided this carefully, and with the full information I had, and I held it, because it was the most functional emotion available to me in that situation, and it kept me organized. In the 3rd month, I decided I didn't hate you, which was harder than hating you, because hatred is clean, and the thing that replaced it was not clean. What replaced it was the understanding that you had done something catastrophic, and that I had loved you before the catastrophic thing, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and that I did not know what to do with that." She paused. He was looking at her with the specific attention he gave to things he was treating as the most important information in the room. She said, "In the pre-trial detention, I had a conversation with the public defender that I have thought about many times since. She asked me if I wanted to pursue charges against you personally, through whatever channels were available. I said no. She asked why. I said because I didn't think it would help me. She said that was the most honest answer she'd heard from a client in 6 months. She paused again. He waited. She said, "I want you to know that I did not pursue charges because it would not have helped me. Not because I forgave you. Not because I thought you didn't deserve consequence. Not because I wanted to protect you. Because the energy required for that was energy I needed for other things. I want you to understand the difference." He said, "I understand it." She said, "I'm not done." He said, "Okay." She said, "What I'm building right now is mine. My life. My work. Ren, these things are mine, and they exist independent of anything you do or don't do or anything that happens between us or doesn't happen. I need that to be the foundation of any conversation we have going forward. Not a courtesy to me. A fact." He said, "Yes." She said, "Now you can respond." He was quiet for a moment. He said, I have thought for 6 weeks about what I would say when I could say things to you without the situation requiring me to limit what I said for operational reasons. I had a version prepared." He paused. "The version I prepared was about what I was going to do differently, how I was going to change the things that led to Tuesday, all the ways I was going to be different. And I think that version is true, and I also think that saying it to you right now, in this coffee shop, when you have just told me what you told me, is exactly the wrong version." She looked at him. He said, "The right version is shorter. I did something that cannot be undone, and for which the appropriate response is not a plan for improvement, but a sustained and unconditional acknowledgement that it happened, and that you get to decide what to do with it. That's all I have. The rest is up to you." She looked at him across the coffee shop table. She thought about the 14 months and the Tuesday, and the cell and the courthouse, and the email and the timestamp discrepancy, and the 6 weeks of investigation, and the park, and the yellow paint, and this coffee shop, and the version he had prepared, that he had chosen not to give her because it was the wrong version. She thought about choices and which ones cost what. She said, "All right." She picked up her coffee. She said, "Tell me the version you had prepared." He looked at her. She said, "I want to hear it. Not because I need it, but because I want to understand what you think you owe me. Not what you owe me. What you think." He told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was thorough, and it was specific, and some of it was things she would hold him to, and some of it was things he was not ready to hold him to yet, and some of it was things she did not know how to evaluate until more time had passed. And she listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay. I heard it. I'm going to think about it." He said, "That's all I'm asking." She said, "I know." She looked at her cup. She said, "He grabbed your face in the park." With his hand. He said, "Yes." She said, "He does that to people he's decided are interesting. He decided on you in about 40 seconds. He said, very quietly, 'He's extraordinary.'" She looked at her cup for a moment longer, and then she looked at him, and she said, "Yes, he is." She stood up. He stood. She said, 3 days a week. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, same time each day. You tell me in the morning and I'll tell you if it works. You come to a place I choose, not to the apartment. Not until I say, "You get 2 hours." He said, "I understand." She said, "This is a decision about him." He said, "I know." She said, "Don't make it into something else." He said, "I won't." She picked up her bag. She said, "Tuesday then." She walked out of the coffee shop. She walked the 3 blocks home in the November Chicago morning, and she thought about the version he had prepared and the version he had given her instead, and she thought that the choosing was information, and she filed it carefully in the column it belonged in, and she went home to her son. What Cale had not told Lena, because the timing had not been right, and because he had not wanted to give her information that would change her decisions before she had the chance to make them on her own terms, was that Silas Drent's removal from the organizational picture had not been clean. It had been thorough, the recorded conversation, the evidence chain, the specific finality of what happened afterward in the way that finality worked in Kyle's world, but clean was a different word. And in this case, clean was not what had happened. What had happened was that Silas, in the 4 hours between understanding that Cale knew and the arrival of Cale's people, had made 3 phone calls. 2 of them were to accounts that were his own organizational loose ends, financial instruments being redirected. The 3rd was to a contact in the Aldrin organization, not the current Aldrin leadership, who had their own reasons for wanting a stable relationship with the Morrow network following the resolution of the warehouse incident, but a faction within Aldrin that did not share the leadership's position on stability. A faction that had its own agenda and that had been doing business with Silas in a side arrangement that was separate from the main Silas Morrow Aldrin financial web, a simpler arrangement. Older, predating the warehouse attack, involving information and access traded for specific considerations. Silas had given this faction 3 things in the phone call: an outline of his situation, a description of what KL was likely to do in response, and a piece of information that he had been holding as a contingency for exactly this kind of emergency. The piece of contingency information was Lena's location in the chosen city. Not the apartment number, the city, the neighborhood, the 2 parks she frequented, the coffee cart woman named Daria. Enough. Enough for a competent team to work with, and the Aldrin faction was competent. KL had not known about the 3rd phone call when he told Lena about Silas's network. He had known about the 2 financial calls. His people had flagged the 3rd call 4 days later, when the phone record surfaced in a secondary sweep, and by that point, Lena had already been in the Chicago apartment for 3 days, and the information about the chosen city was no longer current. He had exhaled one slow breath when he understood this, and had not exhaled again fully until the 4th call from his monitoring team in the following week confirmed that the Aldrin faction's activity had been detected in the chosen city too late, because Lena was already in Chicago, where he could manage the perimeter in a way he could not at a distance. He had not told her any of this because he had not wanted her to know that the move to Chicago had been not only a security recommendation, but a response to a threat he had already assessed as active. He had let her make the choice as if the information were balanced when it was not, and he understood this was a repetition of a pattern, making a decision, for her using incomplete information presented as complete, and that it was not the same order as the Tuesday, but that it was the same architecture. And he was going to have to tell her. He had been building toward telling her for 5 days when the situation removed the option of choosing his moment. It was a Tuesday. The specific bitter quality of that coincidence did not escape him, and he was in a meeting with 2 of his senior people when the call came from the monitoring team. The Aldrin faction had found the Chicago apartment, not through him, through a piece of information that had been in Silas's possession, something Kyle had not known Silas had, which was a record of a property transaction from 8 months before that was connected, at 2 removes, to the holding company that owned the building Lena was now living in. The connection was thin and required work to trace, but the Aldrin faction had been working it, and they had arrived. Not at the building. The monitoring team had intercepted the reconnaissance before it reached the building, but the reconnaissance was happening, which meant the building was no longer safe. He ended the meeting in 30 seconds. He called Lena. She answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she was home. He said, "You need to take Ren and leave the apartment right now. Don't pack. Don't call anyone. Take the north exit of the building, not the lobby. The north exit, through the parking structure, and walk east 3 blocks. My car will be there." She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which was the amount of time it took for him to understand that she was processing the instruction and not asking questions, which told him something about the 8 months that he would think about later. She said, "How long do I have?" He said, 7 minutes. Possibly 10. She said, "I'll be at the east end of the parking structure in 5. She hung up. He was already moving. He called the car. He called 2 of his people and gave them the positions he needed them to hold, and for how long. He called a 3rd and gave different instructions. He was in the car before Lena was in the parking structure, and he was 3 blocks east of the building at 4 minutes and 40 seconds after the call. And at 5 minutes and 12 seconds after the call, Lena came through the door of a parking structure on the east side of a building in Chicago, with Ren against her chest in the carrier she had been using since he was 3 months old. wearing a coat that was not fully zipped and carrying nothing else. And she looked at the car, and she got in without a word. He handed Ren a teething ring from the bag on the back seat. He had started keeping one there after the second park visit, and he drove. She sat in the passenger seat and said nothing for 4 blocks, and then she said, "Tell me what happened." He told her. He told her the whole thing, the 3rd phone call from Silas that he had not known about until 4 days after the fact, the Aldrin faction, the reconnaissance, and the specific piece he had been deciding how to tell her about, which was that the move to Chicago had been a response to a threat he had not disclosed fully when he made the recommendation. He told it without preamble and without construction. He told it the way he told things, when there was no version of the truth that helped him, and the only available option was the one he had been telling himself. For 5 days, that he was going to give her when the moment was right. The moment had been removed by circumstances, and he was giving it to her in a moving car with Ren chewing a teething ring in the back seat and 3 of his people holding positions in a building they were driving away from. And this was not the right moment either, but it was the only moment available. And he gave it to her entirely. When he finished, she was looking out the passenger window at Chicago going past. She said, "You knew the threat was active when you told me to consider moving." He said, "Yes." She said, "You framed it as a recommendation based on incomplete information." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's the same architecture as Tuesday." The silence in the car had a physical weight. He said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to understand that I know the difference between the scale. I know the Tuesday was worse. I know what you did with Silas was the right decision operationally. I know that you came to me with the information as soon as the situation required it." He said, "But," she said, "but the architecture is the same, making a decision for me by controlling what I know. I cannot live in proximity to that. If that doesn't change not the scale of it, the pattern of it, I can't." He said, "I know." She said, "I need to know if you understand why it can't change. Not just that I've said it, can't." He said, "Because you have spent 8 months building a life on the foundation of being the person who decides things for yourself with complete information. And every time I make a decision using information you don't have, I'm removing the flaw from that foundation. Even when my intention is protection, even when the protection is real." She looked at him from the passenger seat. She said, "Yes." He said, "I understand why." She said, "Do you understand what it requires from you?" He said, "It requires me to give you information that frightens you and trust you to make decisions with it. It requires me to stop treating your safety as something I manage and start treating it as something we manage together." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a block. He said, "I can do that." She said, "You've said that kind of thing before." He said, "I know. The difference this time is that I understand specifically what I failed at the last 2 times. Before, I understood in the general sense that I had made a bad decision. Now I understand the specific mechanism. The mechanism is that I treat information about risk as a thing I carry alone because carrying it alone feels like protection. It is not protection. It is the architecture of a person who was never taught that sharing a load doesn't weaken the structure, it distributes it." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Where did that come from?" He said, "I've been thinking about the things you've said about structures, buildings, the way you talk about load distribution." She said, "You've been listening." He said, "I've been listening since October, 14 months ago. I should have been acting on it sooner." She turned back to the window. Ren made a sound from the back seat that was the cadence of an observation rather than a distress signal, and she said, without turning, "He's fine. He finds this interesting." He said, "He finds everything interesting." She said, "Yes." And there was something in the word that was not quite warmth and not quite not warmth. Something in between. Something she was not yet ready to name, and that he was not going to press her to name. He drove. She looked at Chicago going past the window. Wren considered the teething ring with focused attention. The car moved through the city in the November afternoon, and the situation, while not resolved, had at least been brought into the same space as honesty, which was the beginning of the only structure Lena Vasher was willing to build in. He took them to a different building, one that was not connected to any transaction that Silas could have known about, one that his people had secured in the preceding hour, and she walked in and looked at the apartment and said, "The light is worse." He said, "I know. It was the most secure option available in the time." She said, "Okay." She looked at the second bedroom. It was not painted. She said, "Do you have paint?" He said, "I can have paint here in an hour." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Yellow. Same as before." He said, "All right." She set Wren down on the blankets she had not had time to pack, and that had been in the car already. He had kept a blanket in the car, the specific green one that Wren favored, and she sat down on the floor beside Wren, and she looked at the blanket for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and she said, "You had his blanket in the car?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Since when?" He said, "Since the first park visit." She looked at the blanket. She said, "Okay." She did not say anything else about it. She picked up Wren and held him in the way she held him when she was thinking about things she was not going to say out loud yet. And he understood this because he had been learning her language for 14 months, and the additional 6 weeks of investigation had taught him the things he had not learned in the 14. And he said, "I'll see about the paint." He left the room. She sat on the floor with Wren, and she thought about Tuesday, and the architecture, and the load distribution, and the blanket in. The car since the first park visit, and the yellow paint ordered in an hour for a second bedroom in a building chosen under operational pressure. She thought about all of it with the specific methodical attention she had always applied to the things she needed to understand. And she thought that the columns were full, and that the sum at the bottom of the ledger was not what she had been expecting when she added up what was in them. And she thought that what to do with the sum was the question she was going to have to answer, and that she was not going to answer it today, but that she was closer than she had been in November, and closer than she had been in the park, and closer than she had been in the coffee shop, and that closer was, for now, the most honest number she had. The Aldrin faction situation was resolved in 72 hours through a combination of what Cale's people did directly and what the Aldrin leadership did once they were made aware that a faction within their organization was actively working against the terms of the informal arrangement that had kept the Morrow-Aldrin relationship stable following the warehouse resolution. The Aldrin leadership had their own interest in suppressing the faction, which made the resolution faster than it would have been otherwise, and required less from Kale than he would have needed to give if the interests had not aligned. He told Lena about it on the second day, not as a completed report, but as an update, because he was practicing the new architecture, and the new architecture meant not waiting for completion before sharing. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "Of course." She said, "That's what of course means in your world, isn't it?" "The new version," he said. "The version I'm building." She said, "Yes." She said, "How long will it take?" He said, "To finish the Aldrin situation, another day. Probably." She said, "That's not what I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long will it take for the new version to be the version and not the work in progress?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know. That's the honest answer." She said, "I know it is. I'm not asking for a timeline. I'm asking for the acknowledgement that it's a process and that I get to observe the process before I make any decisions about what it means." He said, "You have that, as long as you need." She said, "Okay." She said goodnight. He said goodnight. She put the phone down and sat in the second apartment with the unfinished second bedroom and Ren asleep in the baby monitor, and she thought about processes and timelines and the sum at the bottom of the ledger, and she thought that she was going to sleep on it, and that sleeping on it was not the same as avoiding it, and that she was going to wake up tomorrow in a Chicago apartment with a child who had his father's face and who had grabbed that face with one hand in a park like someone taking inventory, and she was going to go through the day with that fact and see what the day made of it. She turned off the light. She slept. Ren breathed on the monitor. Chicago held itself up outside the window in the November dark, and the process continued. The paint arrived on the third day in the new apartment, which was also the day the Aldrin situation was formally resolved and the day Lena's attorney received the final documentation from Cale's attorney confirming that the judicial vacating process had been completed and that her record was clear. Her attorney called her in the afternoon and used the word clear, and Lena sat with the phone after the call ended, and she thought about clear and what it meant and what it did not mean, and she thought that clear was a legal condition and not an experiential one, and that the record being clear did not change the 7 months, did not unbuild the life she had built in the chosen city, did not unlearn what she had learned about what she was capable of, did not return the dinner that had not happened in October or the hand that had not been held in the room with the fluorescent lights. Clear was the beginning of a different kind of accounting, not the closing of the ledger. She called Kyle. She said, "The attorney called." He said, "I know." Mine called as well. She said, "Thank you for the legal work." He said, "That was the minimum." She said, "I know. I'm saying it anyway." She thought about what else to say, and she said, "The paint is here." He said, "I know. I had it sent over this morning." She said, "Yellow again." He said, "Yes." She said, "Come help me paint it." There was a silence on his end that was 3 seconds long, and that had a specific quality. She had been cataloging for 2 months. The silence of Cale Morrow, receiving information he had not anticipated and processing, whether it was what it appeared to be. She waited. He said, "Now," she said, "this afternoon. It needs 2 coats. Bring clothes you don't mind ruining." He said, "I'll be there in an hour." She said, "The north entrance." He said, "All right." She put the phone down. She picked up Ren from the blanket and she looked at him and she said, "We're painting your room today." He looked at her with the expression that said he found this development acceptable. She carried him to the second bedroom and she looked at the unpainted walls and she thought about the chosen city and the original yellow room and the forensic attention to a paint swatch and the blanket in the car and the teething ring in the bag and the version he had not given her because it was the wrong version and the one he had given her instead. And she thought about the sum at the bottom of the ledger, and she thought that she was not drawing conclusions. She was painting a room. He arrived in 53 minutes, which meant he had not needed to go home to change clothes. He was wearing dark trousers and a shirt she had not seen. And he had a drop cloth under one arm and a roll of painter's tape in his hand, which told her he had stopped somewhere on the way. She said, "You bought supplies." He said, "You didn't specify whether there were supplies." She said, "There are some. Bring yours anyway." She set Ren up in the bouncy seat in the corner of the second bedroom. He liked to be in the room where the activity was, which was consistent with his general position on the world, and they taped the trim and spread the drop cloth and opened the paint, and she handed him a roller, and she took one and they started on opposite walls. The room was not large. They worked in a silence that was not uncomfortable, not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who were doing something with their hands and who were in the same room and who were, for the moment, not required to perform or explain anything, and who were finding that this was its own kind of communication. She said, after they had been working for 20 minutes. In the facility, I thought about the first conversation we had, about the umbrella. He kept rolling. He said, the coat check. She said, you held the door. He said, you had already taken the right umbrella. She said, I had. I was still arguing about it for completeness. He said, I noticed that. She said, I know you noticed. I noticed you noticing. He looked at her over his shoulder. She was looking at the wall she was painting. He turned back to his. He said, what did you think about it? In the facility. She said, I thought about what I had decided in the moment. I looked at you and what that decision meant in retrospect, whether the decision had been wrong. He said, had it been? She was quiet for a moment. She said, no. The decision was correct based on the information I had. The information I was working with was incomplete, which wasn't my error. He said, no, it was mine. She said, yes. She dipped her roller. She said, I also thought about the dinner table, when I told you what I told you, that it frightened me. He said, what I felt when you said that. She said, what did you feel? He said, that you had said the most honest thing I had heard from anyone in 15 years. That it was the specific honesty of a person who was trusting me with something that cost her something. I didn't know how to hold that in a way that was adequate to what it was. She said, what did you do with it? He said, I held it the way I held things. I didn't know what to do with. Carefully and separately from everything else, where it wouldn't affect the parts of my life that required a different kind of operation. She said, that's what broke. He said, yes, the separation. When Tuesday happened, the separation was what made it possible to sign without asking. She said, because the part of you that loved me was in a different compartment from the part that signed. He said, yes. She said, and now he looked at her across the half-painted room. He said, now there is no compartment system that I trust. I've been operating without the compartments for 2 months, and it is the most inefficient way I have ever run anything, and I think it is the correct way. She looked at him. She said, you're saying that collapsing the compartments makes you less efficient. He said, significantly. She said, and you're still doing it. He said, yes. She looked at the wall she had been painting. Ren, in the bouncy seat, was making an observation about the color with the vocal cadence of someone who had been consulted and approved. She said, he likes the yellow. He said that. She said, the bouncing means approval. He said, I'll take it. She said, take a break. I'll get water. She went to the kitchen and she stood at the counter and she thought about compartments and the dinner table and the umbrella and the what I felt and the yes and the bouncing in the bouncy seat. And she thought that the ledger was not the right tool for this anymore and that she needed a different tool, and she did not know yet what it was. And that was all right, because she was going to find it in the same way she found everything she needed, by looking for it carefully with the information available, updating as new information arrived, and trusting the process rather than the conclusion. She filled 2 glasses of water, and she went back to the half-painted yellow room, and she handed him the glass, and she picked up her roller, and she said, second coat, after this dries. He said, how long? She said, an hour, maybe less. The light in here is actually better than I thought. He said, the south exposure. She said, yes. She started on the second section of her wall. He started on his. Ren bounced with the specific enthusiasm of someone who was fully satisfied with the direction of events. She did not make a decision that afternoon. She did not make one the next day either. She made one on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the painting, when KL came for the Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday visit, and Ren reached for him before he had fully sat down the specific, purposeful reach of a 7.5-month-old who had developed a preferred list and was indicating membership, and Kyle took him with the specific, careful attention he gave to everything that was fragile and important. And Lena watched this from the doorway of the kitchen with a glass of coffee, and she thought, there it is, the thing at the bottom of the ledger. Not forgiveness. She was not there yet, and she was not going to pretend she was. Not trust. She was building that, and it was not complete, and she did not know when it would be. Something else. The recognition, precise and undeniable, that the sum of what was in the columns added up to something she was not ready to walk away from, and that not being ready to walk away from it was different from forgiving and different from trusting, and was its own category. Something that needed a word she had not yet found. She looked at Ren in Kale's arms, with his hand on Kale's jaw, taking inventory again, and she thought, I'll find the word. I have time. The structure is still being built. She went to the kitchen, and she made him a coffee, the black one, no sugar, which she had made approximately 40 times before Tuesday and had not made since, and which she made now, without thinking about it, until she had already made it and was carrying it out of the kitchen. And then she thought about it, and she decided that was information too, and she filed it in the column it belonged in, and she set the coffee on the table beside him, and she sat down across from them, and she said, tell me what you found out about Silas. The full version, not the managed one. And Kale looked at her, and he told her, all of it, without managing it. The full version of what he had found out about Silas took 40 minutes to tell. She listened to all of it, with the attention she gave to financial presentations, the complete attention, tracking both what was said and what the structure of the saying revealed about the speaker. He told her about the extraction mechanism, the timeline, the specific way Silas had constructed the bait he had used on the Tuesday. He told her about the secondary records he had found, a communication history between Silas and the Aldrin faction that predated the warehouse attack by 11 months, which meant the attack had been planned before Silas had his exit fully in place, which meant the attack was partly his, not the execution of it, but the enabling of it. He told her that what Silas had done with the warehouse information was not a separate operation from what he had done with the evidence against her. It was the same operation. The attack, providing the chaos that made the evidence plausible, and the evidence ensuring the chaos was attributed to betrayal rather than to Silas's own actions. It was a compound structure, she thought. Two load-bearing elements working together, each making the other more effective. She had not known this before now. She had known the structure was deliberate, but she had not known it was compound. She said, when he finished. He designed the Tuesday. Kale said, yes. She said, the anger you were in when you signed. The 3 a.m. He designed the conditions for that. He said, he knew my decision-making under acute operational crisis. He knew exactly which variables to stack to produce the outcome he needed. She said, he knew you. He said, yes. She looked at her coffee. She said, that's not an excuse for what you did. He said, I know. I'm not presenting it as one. She said, I know you're not. I'm saying it out loud because I need to hear myself say it and still be able to look at the full picture at the same time. He said, I understand. She said, and I can. She looked at him. Look at the full picture, and also know that it doesn't change the Tuesday. Both of those things are true. He said, yes. She said, okay. She picked up her coffee. She looked at Ren, who had fallen asleep against Kale's shoulder with the completeness of someone who had decided the situation was settled and there was no reason to remain awake. She looked at this for a moment. She said, he does that when he's decided something is safe. He said, quietly, I know. She thought, yes, That's the word I've been looking for. Not forgiveness, not trust. Safe. She thought about safe and what she meant by it and whether she had enough information yet to mean it, and she thought that she was close, and that close was, today, the most honest position she had. She thought, close enough to sit in the same room, close enough to make the coffee, close enough to watch him hold the child and feel something that was not entirely anger and not entirely grief, and that had a quality she was going to allow herself to feel without naming it yet. Because naming it before it was fully formed was the kind of error she had stopped making in the second month. She held the coffee cup. She looked at Cale and at the child asleep on his shoulder. She said, "Come back. Saturday." He said, "Yes," she said, "and bring the drop cloth. The trim on the second bedroom still needs a second pass." He said, "All right," she said, "and call before you come. Every time. Until I tell you not to." He said, "Every time." "Yes," she said. "Okay." She got up and took both coffee cups to the kitchen, and she washed them in the methodical way she washed things, which was not mechanically, but with attention, because she had learned in 8 months that the attention you gave to small things was the practice of the attention you needed for large ones. She dried the cups, and she put them away, and she stood at the kitchen window, and she looked at Chicago in the December morning, and she thought, this is where I am. In this kitchen, in this city, with this man in the next room, holding the child we made in the specific period when things were what they appeared to be, before they became what they became. And I am making a decision not today and not tomorrow, but in the accumulation of the days, in the way you built a structure day by day, load by load, trusting the process and not the blueprint, updating as the conditions revealed themselves, building something that was better than the plan because it was built on the actual ground rather than the imagined ground. She turned off the kitchen light. She went back to the living room. She sat down. Ren slept. Cale looked at her across the room with the specific quality of attention that she had been learning to read for 14 months. And she looked back, and neither of them said anything, because some things were more accurate in silence than in language, and this was one of them. December in Chicago was the kind of cold that did not negotiate. It arrived with the specific authority of a season that had earned its place by outlasting everything that came before it. And it settled into the city with a permanence that was either brutal or clarifying depending on your relationship to permanence. Lena Vasher had developed, in the last 8 months, a complicated relationship with permanence. She had built things that were intended to be temporary and found they had become essential. She had been placed in situations that were intended to be temporary and found they had restructured her permanently. And she had arrived at the understanding that the distinction between temporary and permanent was less useful than the distinction between chosen and unchosen, and that what she was building now was the former and not the latter, and that this was the most important architectural decision she had made. She was thinking about this on a Saturday morning in the second week of December when Cale arrived for the Saturday visit, and she opened the door and said, before he could come in. "Come in." He stopped. She said, "I mean come in, to the apartment, not just for the visit. Come in and sit down, and don't watch the clock." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "All right." He came in. He sat down on the couch that was in the living room of the Chicago apartment, her couch, bought by her and positioned by her, and in the apartment she had organized in the way she organized everything, with attention to what was functional and what was true. She said, "I've been thinking about what I'm building." He said, "The second bedroom trim," she said. "No, the larger thing." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I've been treating this as 2 separate ledgers, the Ren ledger and the us ledger, keeping them in different columns, maintaining the separation, because the separation felt like the responsible thing to do. It felt like not letting what happened to me affect a decision I'm making for him, and not letting him be used as a reason to make a decision for myself. He said, and she said, and I've realized that the separation is an artifact of the situation rather than an honest accounting of it. The two ledgers are actually the same ledger, because the decision about what I am to you is also a decision about what environment Ren grows up in, and the decision about what environment Ren grows up in is also a decision about who I am choosing to be and what I am choosing to build. And none of those things can be separated without losing something essential about each of them. He listened to all of this. She said, I'm not announcing a conclusion. I'm telling you that I've stopped treating it as two separate problems. He said, what does it look like as one problem? She thought about this. She said, a structure that is not finished but that is standing. That has a load-bearing element that I've been treating as ornamental because I wasn't ready to put weight on it, and that I am beginning to understand is not ornamental. He said, what is the load-bearing element? She looked at him. She said, the fact that I would not have sent the email that morning if I had not trusted you enough to flag something I wasn't certain about. The fact that in 14 months I became a person who sends honest emails about discrepancies to the person she trusts most in her life, which is not a person I was before the 14 months, which means the 14 months made me that person, which means the 14 months are part of the foundation of who I am now, even though the Tuesday happened in the middle of them. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, I didn't know you felt that. She said, I know. I'm telling you now. He said, what does it mean for the structure? She said, it means I'm not going to maintain the separation. I'm going to acknowledge that the ledger is one ledger and that the sum is what it is. And I'm going to let the structure develop from that position. Not quickly, not without conditions, but from that position rather than from the position of treating everything as separate problems that can be solved independently. He said, what do you need from me to build from that position? She said, the same things I've already said. Complete information. The architecture of consulting rather than managing. The structural change. Not the intention of it, but the actual practice of it. He said, I know what I need to do. She said, I know you do. What I'm telling you is that I'm going to be watching for whether you do it. Not to catch you failing, to know when it's true. He said, I understand the difference. She said, okay. She looked at the living room. She said, do you want coffee? He said, yes. She went to the kitchen. She made it. She brought it back. She sat on the other end of the couch with her own cup and she said, tell me about something that isn't the situation. He said, what she said? Anything. The last book you read. Something that happened this week that has nothing to do with any of this. He looked at her for a moment and she thought she saw, in his expression, the specific quality of a person being given something they had not known they needed. He said, I've been trying to read the book you left on the table when you evacuated the first apartment. She said, the Didion. He said, yes. I'm finding it harder than I expected. She said, how far in? He said, 40 pages. She said, it gets better. He said, when she said, around page 90. The thing you think it's about stops being what it's about. He said, that's not a reassuring description. She said, it's an accurate one. He said, I'll keep going then. She said, yes. Ren, from the yellow bedroom, made the sound that meant he was awake, and considering whether to announce it formally, she got up. She said, I'll get him. Don't go anywhere. He said, I'm not going anywhere. She went to get Ren. She carried Ren out of the yellow bedroom into the living room, and Ren saw Kale on the couch and performed the specific full-body expression of satisfaction that had been, for the last 3 weeks, his consistent response to Kyle's presence. and Lena thought about what 7-month-old decisions meant and whether they were evidence of something. And she thought that Ren's decisions were the most uncomplicated evidence she had in this situation, and that uncomplicated evidence was worth something, even when everything else was complex. She sat back down on the couch with Ren between them, not deliberately positioned as a buffer, but because this was the available configuration, and Kyle and Ren engaged in the specific interaction that had developed over 3 weeks of Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday visits, which involved KL producing the teething ring that was now kept in the apartment rather than the car, and Ren receiving it with the satisfaction of someone whose preferences are known and respected. She watched this, and she thought about known and respected, and whether those words applied to the larger situation, and she thought they were beginning to. And that beginning to was more than she had in October. She said, "Mara wants to meet you." He looked at her. She said, "My sister." I mentioned her. He said, "I know who she is." She said, "She's coming in January. She's been wanting to meet you since the park." He said, "How did you describe me to her?" She thought about this. She said, "Complicated and trying." He said, "That's accurate." She said, "She's going to ask you direct questions and not soften them." He said, "I'll answer them directly and not soften the answers." She said, "Good. That's the right approach with Mara." He said, "I'll keep that in mind." She said, "She's going to ask about the Tuesday." He said, "I know." She said, "I need you to not get defensive." He said, "I won't." She said, "I know you don't think you will. I'm telling you that her approach is going to feel confrontational, and the instinct will be to manage it. Don't." He looked at her. He said, "You're coaching me." She said, "Yes." He said, "For a meeting with your sister?" She said, "Yes." He said, "All right." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Lena." She looked at him. He said, "Thank you." She said, "For what he said, for January." She understood what he meant, not the logistics of it, not the fact of the meeting, but the thing behind it, which was that the existence of a meeting in January meant she was thinking in terms of months rather than days, and that months meant a different kind of structure than days. She said, "Don't read too much into it." He said, "I know. I'm noting it without reading into it." She said, "That's a very precise distinction." He said, "I've been practicing precision." She said, "I know." She looked at Ren, who was examining the teething ring with the focused attention she had observed from his first day, the same attention she had for numbers. And she thought about inheritance and what it meant and what forms it came in, and she thought that she was going to have a long time to think about that, and that she was going to let herself have the time. She said, "Stay for lunch." He said, "All right." She went to the kitchen. He stayed. It was the 3rd week of December, and Mara's January visit was scheduled, and the yellow room had its 2nd coat finished, and the structure of the Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday visits had evolved into something that was less structured and more flexible. Without being announced as less structured and more flexible, she had simply stopped, specifying the time, 1 Thursday, and said, "Come when you can." And he had come at a time that worked for both of them without requiring negotiation. And she had noted this as evidence of something and had not said so out loud. She was building a list of these evidences, not in the documentation folder, which had been closed on the day the judicial vacating was finalized, but in a different kind of list, one that she kept not in a folder, but in the running tally of a person who was paying attention to whether the practice matched the intention. The list was growing. She was not done growing it. She was going to need more time with it. She had told him this on a Thursday afternoon when he had asked, in the direct way he had been asking things since the car. "Where are you?" she had said. "Building the list," he had said. What list she had told him about the evidences list and the practice matching the intention and the need for more time. He had said, "All right." He had not asked how much time. She noted that. The evening of December 21st was the first time she sent him away. Not because he had done anything wrong, she clarified this immediately, which she knew was its own kind of evidence, but because she was having a night, the specific category of night that arrived without warning and that required solitude. The kind of night where everything that she had organized and processed and compartmentalized and built into structure in the last 9 months arrived simultaneously and without the structural containment she usually had available. And she needed the apartment to be hers in the complete sense, with no one else's presence in it, with just her and Ren and the particular silence of a woman who had been through a great deal and who sometimes needed to be through it without an audience. He had arrived for the Thursday visit, and she had opened the door, and she had looked at him and she had said, "Not tonight. I'm sorry. I need you to not come in tonight." He had looked at her face, which she thought was probably telling him the category of night. It was without her needing to specify it, and he had said, "All right." He had handed her the teething ring, which she took, because Ren needed it regardless, and he had said, "Call me if you need anything." She had said, "I will." He had left. She had stood at the closed door for a moment, and she had thought about the fact that he had left without pressing or asking for explanation, or offering to help in a way that required her to manage his response to her needing him to go. And she had thought that this was the list, and that she had just added something to it. She had sat on the floor with Ren that evening, and she had let the 9 months arrive, and she had sat with them for the 2 hours they required. And then she had put Ren to bed, and she had called Mara, and she had talked for an hour, and by the end of it, the 9 months had gone back into their appropriate structures, and she was able to breathe again in the normal way. She texted him, "I'm okay." He texted back, "I know." She thought about "I know" and what it meant for a person to say, "I know," after being sent away at the door. And she thought that it meant he trusted that she would tell him if she wasn't. And that trusting that was an act of respect for the person she had built herself into being. And she filed it in the list under the heading Trust, going in both directions, which was a heading she had not had 2 months ago and that she was beginning to have now. Christmas was quiet. She did not spend it with him that was not where they were. And she was not going to pretend they were somewhere they were not. Because pretending was the architecture of the person she had been before 8 months, and she was not that person anymore. She spent Christmas morning with Ren and the video call with Mara and the specific warmth of a day that was hers and theirs in the specific, complete way that the chosen city had taught her things could be. She sent him a text in the afternoon, "Merry Christmas." He replied, "Merry Christmas." And then, after a pause, "Ren." She replied with a photograph, which was the first photograph she had sent him, of Ren sitting in a pile of wrapping paper that he found significantly more interesting than whatever had been inside it, wearing a small hat shaped like a star that Mara had sent from Portland, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who had opinions about the photographic intrusion. She looked at the photograph before she sent it, and she thought about what she was sending, and she sent it. He replied, "He's extraordinary." She replied, "Yes." She put the phone down. She looked at Ren in the star hat. She thought, "Yes." And she thought, "This is what I'm building." And she thought that she could feel, for the first time in 9 months, the shape of what it was becoming. The thing Lena had been trying to name for 3 months arrived, without announcement, on a Thursday afternoon in January when Mara was in the city and he'd been there for 3 days, and had met Kyle on the 2nd day, with the specific focused attention that Mara brought to things she had formed strong opinions about in advance, and was now updating in real time. The meeting had been in the apartment, because Lena had decided she was not going to stage it, not in a coffee shop, not in a public space, not in any location that had the shape of a meeting with specific exits. She had decided she was going to have it in the apartment, because the apartment was hers and Ren's, and increasingly, in increments, she was not yet ready to formalize. Also a space where Kyle was present without requiring a scheduled visit and a clock. She sat in the chair. Kyle sat on the couch. Mara sat in the other chair and looked at Kyle with the expression of a woman who had driven 800 miles and had 14 months of second-hand information and one specific question. She said, "Why didn't you ask her?" Kyle said. "Because I was in a state that prioritized the sensation of certainty over the responsibility of verifying. And because I had spent 15 years being able to treat certainty as a reliable tool, and I did not question it until it was too late." Mara said, "That's a very structured answer." He said, "It's the honest one." Mara said, "The honest one doesn't feel any better." He said, "No, it shouldn't." Mara looked at him for a moment. She said, "She built an entire life in 8 months." He said, "I know." Mara said, "She built it better than the one before it." He said, "I know that too." Mara said, "What do you think that means?" He said, "I think it means the Tuesday cost her something that had value, and she went and built something with different value in its place, and the different thing is not a lesser thing because it was built in worse conditions. I think she is a better version of the person I met at the coat check because she had to become that person. And I think that the fact that she had to become it the way she did is the thing I am going to live with. And the thing I can do now is not take up the space that belongs to who she became." Mara looked at him. She looked at Lena. She said, "Is that what he does? Not take up the space?" Lena thought about the door on December 21st, and the "I know" text, and the photograph on Christmas, and the drop cloth, and the painter's tape he had. Stopped at a hardware store to buy, because she had not specified whether there were supplies. She said, "He's learning too." Mara looked at him again. She said, "You had better keep learning." He said, "Yes." Mara said, "I'm going to call her every 3 days." He said, "I know. She's mentioned it." Mara said, "You're not going to interfere with that." He said, "No." Mara looked at him one more time with the expression of someone completing an assessment. She said, "Okay." And then, because Mara was Mara, "The yellow room is a good color." He said, "She chose it." Mara said, "You had it painted before she asked." He said, "Yes." Mara said, "Because you thought she'd want yellow." He said, "Because I thought Ren would want yellow. She would have wanted what was right for him." Mara looked at him for a long moment and said, "Huh." And then she picked up her coffee and she talked to Lena about something else, and the conversation moved into different territory. And Kale sat on the couch and listened, and occasionally said something, and Ren crawled between the adults, with the focused purpose of someone on a route only they could see. And the afternoon arrived in the Chicago apartment with the specific quality of an ordinary afternoon that was not ordinary at all. And Lena sat in her chair and she thought, there it is. There is the word. Not forgiveness, not trust, not love yet. Though she felt the shape of where it was going, the word was choosing. She was choosing every day, in the accumulation of the days, in the evidences list, and the coffee made, and the door opened, and the door closed, and the photograph sent, and the December 21st night, and the Saturday stays, and the January Mara meeting, and the Ren in the bouncy seat, and the blanket in the car since the first park visit. She was choosing, not once, not in a single declaration, but in the ongoing practice of choosing, one day at a time, with full information and clear eyes and the specific, structural honesty of a woman who had learned what she was built from in the 8 months when she had been required to build. She was choosing. She was going to keep choosing, not because she had to, because she was the person who decided. That evening, after Mara had gone back to the hotel, and Ren was asleep in the yellow room, and the apartment was quiet, Kale was putting on his coat at the door. He did this now without her asking. He left in the evenings without being told to, because he understood the rhythm, and the rhythm was hers, and she said, from the couch, "Kyle." He stopped with his coat half on. She said, "I'm not ready to say that it's fine. It isn't fine. What happened is not something that becomes fine with time. I need you to know that I'm not building toward fine." He said, "I know." She said, "What I'm building toward is something that holds both of those things at once. What happened, and also what is happening now. I don't have a word for the structure that holds both of those things. I've been looking for it for 3 months." He said, and she said, "I think the structure is the word. I think the act of building it is what it's called." He looked at her across the apartment, with his coat half on and the December Chicago night visible through the window behind her, and he said, "Yes, I think that's right." She said, "Go home. Come back Saturday." He said, "Saturday." She said, "Call before you come." He said, "I will." She said, "And Kale." He waited. She said, "The Didion, page 90, is accurate." He said, "I'll get there." He finished putting on his coat. He left. She listened to the elevator, and then the lobby, and then silence. And she sat in the quiet apartment with Ren's monitor on the cushion beside her, and the yellow room down the hall, and the documentation folder closed on a drive she had stopped, needing to open, and the evidences list growing in the back of her mind like a structure, gaining floor after floor. And she thought about fine and not fine, and the structure that held both of them, and the act of building being the word for the thing. And she thought that she had never in her life understood what she was building while she was building it, and that this was the first time, and that it was harder than building without understanding, and also more accurate, and that more accurate was the thing she had been trying to be since the 2nd month, and that she was getting there. She thought about forgiveness every time it came up in the things Mara said and in the things people who knew her story said when they thought they were offering comfort. Forgiveness was the word everyone reached for. She thought it was the wrong word. Not because forgiveness was wrong, but because forgiveness implied a specific ledger, transaction, a debt, acknowledged and erased. And what she had was not that. What she had was a ledger with a debit that had not been erased and that was not going to be erased and that she was carrying, not as a wound she was suffering from, but as a fact she was building around. An architect didn't erase the existing conditions on a site. She documented them, assessed them, and built in relationship to them. The existing conditions on this site included a Tuesday in October and a cell with fluorescent lights and a guard who was not allowed to hold her. And a Friday in February, when she had held a child alone and named her after the idea of what a person could become when they decided who they were. The existing conditions also included 14 months of a man reaching for the same glass of sparkling water, and a dinner table conversation that was the most honest thing said in that room in its history, and a coat check argument about an umbrella that had the quality, in retrospect, of a door opening. She was not erasing any of it. She was building around all of it. She was building something that held the debit and the credits and the ongoing transactions and the ledger that was still open. Because it was still open. Because she was alive, and Ren was alive, and Kale Morrow was across the city, putting on his coat in an apartment and reading a book by Joan Didion and learning, in the specific way that people who had been doing one thing for 15 years learned new things, to operate without the compartments. The structure was not finished. She was not going to pretend it was finished. She was going to keep building it, one day at a time, with the full information she insisted on having, and the clear eyes she had earned, and the understanding that the structure was the word, and that she was the one building it, and that she would decide. When it was done, not him, not the situation, not the Tuesday, or the cell, or the fluorescent lights, or the Friday in February. Here, she was the one who decided. She had always been the one who decided. She was going to keep deciding, every day, for as long as it took. And she thought that this, the deciding, the ongoing practice of it, the choosing without conclusion, the structure that held both things at once, was not fine, and was not easy, and was not the story she had planned to be in, and was also the truest thing she had ever built. She looked at Ren on the monitor, breathing in the yellow room. She thought, this is what I'm made of now. All of it. The before, and the during, and the after. It all belongs to me. She turned off the light. She went to bed in the city she had come back to. Not because it was chosen, but because she was choosing it, every day, which was the only kind of choice she trusted anymore. She woke the next morning at 6:15, which was Ren's time rather than hers, and she went to the yellow room and picked him up and held him in the specific way of early mornings, standing at the window that faced south over the Chicago winter street. And she thought about what she had been thinking before she fell asleep, and she thought that the thinking had not resolved into a conclusion, which was appropriate. And she thought that the absence of a conclusion was not the same as the absence of direction, and that she had direction, and that direction was enough. Ren looked out the window at the Chicago morning with his characteristic attention, as if the street below were a problem he was assessing from above, and that he had not yet decided how to approach. She said, "I know. It's complicated." He looked at her. She said, "We're figuring it out." She carried him to the kitchen. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window with Ren on her hip and the tea in her hand and the Chicago morning coming in through the glass. And she thought about all the kitchens she had stood in, the one before the Tuesday, with the sense of a life being built on a foundation that was solid, the one in the chosen city, where she had built the foundation herself out of materials she had not expected to have available. This one, where the foundation was something she was still assessing, but that she was beginning to trust would hold what she was going to put on it. She thought about foundations and what they were made of, and the specific quality of the best ones, which were not the most beautiful or the most impressive, but the most honestly built on the actual ground, with knowledge of what was there, without pretending the difficult conditions were different from what they were. She thought about the actual ground of her situation, and she thought that what was there was complicated and not fine, and also something she was choosing every day, and that the choice itself was the most load-bearing element of the whole structure, and that as long as she kept making it, the structure would hold. She thought about January and Mara's visit extending by 2 days, because Mara had said there was a person she needed to observe across a longer period before she rendered her full verdict, which was the most Mara thing Mara had ever said, and which had made Lena genuinely laugh for the first time in what felt like months. The specific laugh of a woman who had been in the presence of something so characteristically the person she loved, that the laugh arrived before she could manage it. She thought about Mara watching Kale over 2 additional days, and the additional observations Mara had made, including one she had shared with Lena privately on the 3rd evening. He carries it like a person who has actually understood the weight of it, not like someone performing understanding, like someone living with it. She had received this observation with the specific care she gave to information from people whose assessment she trusted, and she had added it to the evidences list. And the evidences list was now long enough that she had stopped counting the items and started feeling the shape of the total. The shape of the total was not what she had expected it to be when she started building the list. The shape of the total was something she was going to need more time to fully understand, but it was becoming visible, the way a building became visible when the framing was up. And visible was more than she had had in October. She called Mara after she put Ren down for his morning nap. Mara answered and said immediately, "How are you this morning?" Lena said. "Thinking," Mara said. "About," she said. "The structure. What it is," Mara said. "And what is it?" Lena thought about it for a moment. She said, "It's a building that's been through a structural event and is still standing. And the event is part of the building now, not separate from it. The way a building that has been through a flood doesn't become a building that has never been through a flood. It becomes a building that knows what it can withstand." Mara was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's different from what you said the first time," Lena said. "Which part?" Mara said. "The first time you said it was still standing and didn't know what it could hold. Now you're saying it knows." Lena thought about this. She said, "Yes," Mara said. "That's not a small thing," Lena said. "I know," Mara said. "Are you okay?" Lena looked out the window of the Chicago apartment at the January morning. She thought about okay, and what it meant, and whether she was it. She said, "I'm not okay in the sense of being fine. I'm okay in the sense of being exactly where I am with full knowledge of where I am. And that is a condition I have chosen. And choosing it is what makes it okay." Mara said, "I'm going to need you to explain the difference between those two things sometime." Lena said, "I know. I'll explain it when I have the right words." Mara said, "You always have the right words eventually." Lena said, "Yes." They said goodbye. She put the phone down. She stood at the kitchen window. She thought about full knowledge and chosen conditions and the right words eventually. And she thought that eventually was a word she had learned to trust in. The last 9 months, not as a promise of resolution, but as an acknowledgement that things arrived in their time, and that the time they arrived in was not always the time you would have chosen, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and that holding both of them without losing either was the specific skill she had been developing since November, and that she was getting better at it every day. She texted him at 10:30 come Tuesday at 11. "Bring the Didion. I want to hear what you think of page 90. He replied in 6 minutes. "I've been there for a week," she replied. And he replied, "You were right. It's not about what I thought it was about." She replied, "It never is." He replied, "I'll be there at 11. She looked at the text exchange and she thought about page 90 and about the thing he had found there, which was a woman going through something that had restructured her permanently, and writing about it with the specific honesty of someone who was not performing the experience, but documenting it with the precision of a person who understood that documentation was itself a form of survival. She thought about her own documentation, the 15 items in the documentation folder, now closed. The evidences list, ongoing. The note on Christmas morning about the star hat and the wrapping paper. The coffee cups washed and put away in the specific way she washed things. She thought that all of it was documentation, and that documentation was a form of building, and that she had been building, in every form available to her, since the moment she was given back the use of her hands. She put the phone in her pocket. She went to check on Ren. He was asleep in the yellow room, with the morning light coming through the window in the specific pale way it came in January. The light that was not yet spring, but that was moving toward it. The light that knew what it was going to be, even before it arrived. She stood in the doorway and she looked at the sleeping child, and she thought about what she was building and who she was building it for. And she thought that the answer to the second question was both of them, Ren and herself. The two of them in this city, in this apartment, in this yellow room, in this life that was hers and was being built every day, with full information and clear eyes, and the choice made and remade, the way you made the load-bearing decisions that held everything else up, not once, but continuously. for as long as the structure stood. She thought about Kale coming on Tuesday at 11 with the Didion and whatever he had found on page 90. She thought about what kind of thing it was to read a book someone had left when they evacuated an apartment, and to bring it back, and to have read to page 90 before being asked. She thought about the evidences list. She thought about Tuesday, and whether she was ready for what it was beginning to be, which was not a visit on a schedule, but something that did not have a schedule anymore. Something that was arriving in its time, the way things arrived when they were real rather than managed. She thought, I'm ready. Not all the way. Not for every version of it. Ready enough to open the door on Tuesday at 11 and see what page 90 had made him think, and to tell him what it had made her think. And to sit in the apartment with the south-facing windows and the yellow room and the child between them and the coffee on the table and the evidences list growing and the structure building. Ready enough for that. Ready enough to say, I'm choosing. Every day. With full information. This is what choosing looks like. This is what building looks like from the inside, not clean, not finished, not fine, but real and ongoing and mine. She closed the yellow room door softly. She went to make tea. The Chicago morning continued outside the window in the specific, reliable way that Chicago mornings continued regardless of what was happening inside the apartments they moved past. And she thought that reliability was something she had learned to find in unexpected places, and that this was one of them, and that it was enough. She had been in Chicago for 7 weeks when she finally went back to the building where they had lived during the 14 months. Not to the apartment that had other tenants now and was not hers in any sense, but to the block, the neighborhood. The specific street where she had walked to the coffee shop every morning, and where the coat check had been that winter evening when she had argued about an umbrella. She went on a Saturday in late January with Wren in the carrier, in the cold, because she had decided that she needed to do this, and that waiting until she felt ready for it was not a useful strategy. That the useful strategy was to go and see what it was and what it was not. She stood on the block for a while. She looked at the building and the street and the cold January intersection where the Coat Check restaurant still had its awning. Red and white. Unchanged. She thought about what she had been in that moment. A woman with an umbrella dispute and a sense of humor about it, and no idea that the man holding the door was going to reorganize the next 2 years of her life. She thought about whether she would make the same choice again. With full information. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything serious, without reaching for the easy answer. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer was that the 14 months contained things she would not trade and things she would give anything to have not experienced, and that those things were connected and could not be separated without losing both of them, and that the person she was standing on this street was built from all of it, and that she would not trade being the person she was standing on this street. This was not the same as saying she would choose the Tuesday. She was never going to say she would choose the Tuesday. But the person who had survived the Tuesday and built the life in the chosen city and come back to Chicago, choosing, and who was standing on this street in the cold with Wren against her chest, this person was worth being. She had not known that in November. She was beginning to know it now. She stood on the street for a few minutes more, and then she walked back to the apartment. She fed Wren. She made dinner. Kael called at 7, and she told him where she had been, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How was it?" she said. "Informative," he said. "Good." He did not ask what it had informed, because he understood that not everything that was informative needed to be shared immediately, and that the timing of sharing was part of her architecture, and that he was learning her architecture. She noted this. She said, "Saturday." He said, "Saturday." She said goodnight. She put the phone down. She sat with Wren and the evening and the city outside, and she thought about informative and architecture and the structure still being built. And she thought that she was building it correctly, one load at a time, one true thing at a time. With the full knowledge of the ground it was standing on, she thought that this was the only way she knew how to build. She thought that it was enough. Tha thứ không phải là điều Lena Vasher đã tìm đến. Cô không bao giờ gọi nó là tha thứ. Cô gọi nó là lựa chọn, cái lựa chọn được thực hiện mỗi ngày, được gia hạn mỗi sáng khi cô thức dậy và quyết định lại những gì cô đang xây dựng và cho ai và tại sao. Tha thứ, theo cách mà người ta thường nói về nó, là thứ được ban tặng cho người đã gây ra thiệt hại, một giao dịch sổ cái, một nợ được ghi nhận và xóa bỏ. Điều cô có không phải là điều đó. Điều cô có là một cấu trúc đang được xây dựng trên mảnh đất thực sự của tình huống của mình, với đầy đủ kiến thức về những gì ở đó. Cái thứ ba và cái lệnh và phòng giam dưới ánh đèn huỳnh quang vào ngày thứ 6 trong tháng, hay khi cô giữ Ren một mình và đặt tên cho con trong bóng tối. Tất cả những điều này đều ở đó. Cô không đang xây dựng qua nó. Cô đang xây dựng xung quanh nó, xây dựng cùng với nó, đưa nó vào cấu trúc với tư cách là một yếu tố điều kiện, chứ không phải là một vết thương phải che giấu. Đây là điều mà kiến trúc đã dạy cô. Những điều kiện khó khăn không biến mất khi bạn xây dựng lên chúng. Chúng trở thành một phần của những gì cấu trúc phải chịu đựng. Và cách bạn xây dựng xung quanh chúng là điều quyết định liệu cấu trúc có đứng vững hay không. Cô đang xây dựng để đứng vững. Cô đang xây dựng để Ren có một nền tảng mà con có thể đứng trên đó. Cô đang xây dựng cho chính mình. Cho người phụ nữ đã đứng bên ngoài tòa án với chiếc áo khoác không đóng được và quyết định rằng cô sẽ xây dựng thứ gì đó từ những gì còn lại. Lựa chọn đó, sự lựa chọn đang diễn ra đó, được thực hiện mỗi ngày trong sự tích lũy của những ngày, là điều duy nhất trong câu chuyện này hoàn toàn là của cô. Không ai có thể lấy nó đi. Không ai có thể cho nó. Đó là của cô. Được xây dựng từ những gì cô đã học trong 8 tháng về những gì cô được tạo ra từ đó. Và mỗi ngày, trong sang thang riêng của căn hộ Chicago với Ren trong phòng màu vàng và thành phố bên ngoài cửa sổ và danh sách bằng chứng đang tăng lên và cấu trúc đang được xây dựng. Cô đã chọn. Cô đã chọn. Không phải vì cô phải làm vậy. Không phải vì ai đó đã hỏi cô. Bởi vì cô là người quyết định. Và điều đó, việc là người quyết định, điều không thể bị lấy đi khỏi cô. Điều đã được xây dựng trong những gì có vẻ không thể xây dựng được là hòa bình. Không phải là không có trọng lượng, là biết rằng trọng lượng là của cô để mang, và rằng cô đủ sức mạnh để mang nó, và rằng mỗi ngày cô chọn mang nó là một ngày khác khi cấu trúc đứng vững.